I imagine a vessel moving beneath the surface of the water, silent, invisible, a machine designed not to conquer the waves but to slip beneath them, to vanish into the deep blue and gray, and in that vanishing, to become something more than steel and rivets, to become an idea, a whisper of human ambition translated into form and pressure and darkness. The sea has always held secrets, and perhaps none more compelling than the machines we built to explore its hidden layers, to move through the cold currents far from sunlight, where the world above becomes a distant memory, a shimmering ceiling of silver and refracted light, and where time itself seems to slow, to drift, to pool in the silence between one heartbeat and the next. I think of the earliest dreamers, those who looked at the ocean and wondered what it might be like to breathe beneath it, to move through it, not on its surface, but within its very substance, to be held by the water rather than simply floating upon it, and how that wondering led to sketches and models, to leather and wood, and eventually to iron, each attempt a conversation with the impossible, each failure a lesson written in salt water and pressure. There is something almost meditative about the idea of a submarine, the way it surrenders to the embrace of depth, the way it must trust its own sealed integrity against the weight of an entire ocean pressing inward, tons upon tons of water seeking the smallest weakness, the tiniest flaw, and yet the vessel holds, it descends, it glides through realms where sunlight becomes a memory and then a myth, where bioluminescent creatures drift like stars in an inverted sky. The story of these machines is not simply one of warfare or exploration, though both threads run through it like currents. It is also a story of human persistence, of the strange courage required to climb into a metal tube and allow yourself to be pulled beneath the surface, to trust in mathematics and engineering and the careful welding of seams, to breathe recycled air and navigate by instruments when every human instinct says to surface, to seek the light, to feel the wind. I find myself drawn to the slow evolution of this technology. How it began with such humble materials and such wild hopes, how inventors across centuries and continents independently arrived at similar conclusions, that a vessel could be made to sink, to level itself at a chosen depth, to rise again, and how each of these pioneers faced mockery and skepticism, faced the cold reality of physics and the unforgiving nature of water pressure, and yet they persisted, they refined, they learned from disasters and near misses, they built again. The submarines of the early days were fragile things, uncomfortable, dangerous beyond measure, and yet they represented a fundamental shift in how humans could interact with the ocean, no longer merely skimming its surface in ships, but penetrating its layers, moving through the thermocline, discovering the strange geography of underwater mountains and trenches, the vast plains of the deep sea floor covered in sediment and the bones of ancient creatures. And as the technology matured, as nations recognized the strategic possibilities, as wars made urgent what had once been theoretical, the submarine transformed. It grew larger, more capable. It learned to stay submerged for weeks and then months. It became a platform for torpedoes and missiles, a hunter in the depths, a deterrent that shaped the very architecture of global conflict. And yet, even in this evolution, even as these vessels became instruments of power, they retained something of that original wonder. that audacious dream of moving unseen through the ocean's secret spaces. I imagine the sound inside such a vessel, the hum of machinery, the gentle ping of sonar reaching out into darkness, the muffled quality of voices in close quarters, the awareness that just beyond the hull, separated by mere inches of steel, lies an environment utterly hostile to human life, and how that awareness might sharpen the senses, might make every moment feel both ordinary and miraculous. A routine turned sacred by context. The men and women who have served aboard these vessels, who have descended into the cold and the pressure and the isolation, they have seen things most of us can only imagine. They have watched through periscopes as the world above continued its business. Unaware of the watchers below, they have navigated beneath ice floes in the Arctic, have circled the globe without once breaking the surface, have sat in silence as other ships passed overhead, their propellers churning the water into foam and sound. And now, as I begin to trace this history to follow the thread from those first experimental vessels to the massive strategic submarines of today, I feel the weight of all those journeys, all those descents and ascents, all those hours spent in the twilight zone where pressure makes the hull creak and groan, where every sound carries meaning, where the ocean speaks in a language of density and depth and distance. The dream of underwater travel did not begin with engineers or naval architects. It began with artists and philosophers, with those who looked at the natural world and wondered if humans might learn to move as fish do, might find a way to breathe where there should be no breath, to see in darkness, to navigate currents invisible from above. In the ancient world, stories circulated of divers who could stay submerged for impossible lengths of time, of bells that trapped air beneath the surface, of leather bags inflated with breath. And while these were not submarines in any true sense, they represented the first grasping toward the idea, the first acknowledgement that the barrier between air and water might be, if not broken, then at least carefully negotiated. Leonardo da Vinci sketched designs in the 1500s, drawings that showed a man sealed inside a vessel, mechanisms for ballast and propulsion, but he never built them, and some historians say he deliberately left his plans incomplete, fearing what such a weapon might do in the wrong hands. Understanding that invisibility beneath the waves could shift the balance of naval power in ways both profound and troubling. Centuries passed, and the idea surfaced again and again, each time a little more refined, a little closer to reality. In 1620, a Dutch inventor named Cornelis Drebbel built what many consider the first navigable submarine, a wooden rowboat covered in greased leather, propelled by oars that extended through the sides, sealed with tight fittings to keep the water out. Drebbel demonstrated his vessel in the River Thames, beneath the grey London sky. With King James I reportedly watching from the shore, the craft submerged to depths of perhaps 12 to 15 feet, stayed down for hours, moved along the riverbed while the oarsmen inside worked in dim light, breathing air that must have grown thick and stale, their muscles burning with effort, their faith in the leather seams absolute. We do not know precisely how Drebbel solved the problem of breathable air. Some accounts suggest he carried chemicals that could refresh the atmosphere inside, perhaps potassium nitrate heated to release oxygen, though this seems almost too sophisticated for the era. More likely, the crew simply endured, knowing their time underwater was measured in the capacity of their lungs and the volume of air trapped inside the hull. The vessel was crude, uncomfortable, limited in every practical sense, and yet it worked. It proved the concept. It showed that a sealed chamber could descend, could move, could return, and in doing so it planted a seed that would grow slowly over the next 2 centuries, nourished by war and curiosity in equal measure. In 1776, during the American Revolution, a Yale student named David Bushnell created the Turtle, a one-man submersible shaped like 2 turtle shells joined together, barely large enough for a single operator to sit hunched inside, working pumps and propellers and navigating by compass in near total darkness. The Turtle was designed with a specific purpose: to attach explosive charges to the hulls of British warships, to strike from below where no defense existed, where the massive ships sat vulnerable and unaware. Bushnell equipped his craft with a drill meant to bore into wooden hulls with a detachable mine that could be screwed into place and triggered by a timer. On a September night in New York Harbor, an operator named Ezra Lee climbed into the Turtle and submerged, propelling himself toward HMS Eagle, the British flag ship, working the hand cranks that drove the propeller and controlled depth, breathing the close air, feeling his way through black water toward an enemy that did not know he was coming. Lee reached the Eagle's hull, positioned the drill, and began to turn. But the bit would not penetrate. Perhaps he had struck an iron brace. Perhaps the angle was wrong. Perhaps his strength simply gave out after the long approach. Whatever the reason, the attack failed. Lee released the mine and fled, and the explosive detonated harmlessly in the harbor, sending up a geyser of white water that woke the British fleet, but did no damage. The Turtle never sank a ship, but it demonstrated something important. It showed that submarines could be weapons, could carry the fight to an enemy in ways that surface vessels could not. And though Bushnell's design was too limited for widespread use, too dependent on human strength and endurance, it inspired others to think about what might be possible with better materials, with mechanical power instead of muscle, with designs that could carry more than one brave soul into the deep. Decades passed. The 19th century arrived, and with it came new technologies, new materials, iron instead of wood and leather, steam power instead of oars and hand cranks. And inventors on both sides of the Atlantic began to experiment, to build, to test their theories against the indifferent reality of water pressure and human physiology. In 1863, during the American Civil War, the Confederate Navy launched the H.L. Hunley, named for one of its designers, a vessel built from a converted steam boiler, 40 feet long and less than 4 feet wide, propelled by a hand-cranked propeller, turned by a crew of 8 men sitting in near darkness, their bodies pressed close together, their breath condensing on cold iron walls. The Hunley was a desperate weapon born of desperate circumstances. The Confederacy was blockaded, strangled by Union ships that controlled the coasts and rivers, and so they turned to underwater warfare, to any technology that might break the stranglehold, that might sink the blockading vessels and open the ports to trade and supply. The submarine was tested in Mobile Bay, and then transported to Charleston, and in those tests and transports it proved treacherous. It sank 3 times during training, drowning 5 crew members in the first sinking. 8 in the second, and 8 more in the third, including Horace Hunley himself, the vessel's creator, who died inside his own invention when it filled with water and settled to the bottom. Each time the Hunley sank, it was raised, cleaned of bodies and sediment, and made ready again, because the need was great and volunteers still came forward, still climbed inside knowing the fate of those who had gone before, still turned the cranks and breathed the stale air and trusted that this time would be different. On the night of February 17th, 1864, the Hunley set out from Sullivan's Island. Its target was the USS Housatonic, a Union sloop of war maintaining the blockade just outside Charleston Harbor. The submarine carried a spar torpedo, an explosive charge mounted on a long pole extending from the bow, designed to be rammed against an enemy hull and detonated from a distance, Lieutenant George Dixon commanded. 7 men turned the crank. The vessel moved through cold water at perhaps 3 or 4 knots, slow and steady, approaching the Housatonic from the seaward side, where lookouts would not expect danger, where the darkness was deepest. Sailors on the Housatonic spotted something in the water, something low and strange, and raised the alarm, but it was too late. The Hunley drove its spar torpedo into the ship's starboard side and detonated the charge. The explosion tore open the hull, and the Housatonic sank in shallow water, becoming the first warship in history to be destroyed by a submarine. But the Hunley did not return. It vanished that night, disappearing into the same waters that had claimed it before, and its crew of 8 joined the others who had died aboard, bringing the total to 21 men lost in the service of this single vessel. This iron tube that represented both the promise and the peril of submarine warfare. The wreck was found over a century later, in 1995, resting on the ocean floor just 1,000 yards from where the Housatonic went down. The hull intact but flooded, the crew still at their stations, and when researchers finally raised the Hunley and studied it, they found no obvious cause for the sinking, no battle damage beyond what the submarine had inflicted on itself, leaving the final mystery unsolved, a crew that succeeded in their mission and then simply, silently, slipped away into history. These early vessels, fragile and dangerous as they were, established the fundamental principles. They proved that submarines could be built, could be controlled, could carry out military operations, and as the 19th century progressed, as metallurgy improved and engines became more reliable, designers began to solve the problems that had plagued Bushnell and Hunley and all the others. The Irish-American inventor John Philip Holland spent decades refining his designs, building prototype after prototype, each one incorporating lessons from the last, each one moving closer to a submarine that could dive safely, remain submerged for extended periods, and surface reliably, without depending on the endurance of men turning cranks until their hands bled and their lungs screamed for fresh air. Holland's breakthrough came with the addition of dual propulsion systems, gasoline engines for surface travel, and electric motors for underwater operations. Because combustion engines need air to run, need exhaust to vent, and cannot function in a sealed submerged vessel, but electric motors powered by batteries can run in any environment, silent and efficient, requiring nothing but stored energy. In 1897, Holland launched his 6th and most successful design, a vessel 53 feet long with a cigar-shaped hull that slipped through water with minimal resistance. It could reach speeds of 7 knots on the surface and 6 knots submerged, could dive to 75 feet, could stay down for several hours, and most importantly, it could surface and dive repeatedly without incident, proving that submarine technology had finally matured beyond the realm of desperate experiments and into the realm of practical naval engineering. The United States Navy purchased Holland's design in 1900, commissioning it as the USS Holland, and other nations took notice. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, all began developing their own submarine programs, recognizing that naval warfare was about to change, that the surface of the ocean was no longer the only battlefield, that depth itself had become a strategic dimension. And so the 20th century opened with submarines transitioning from curiosities to essential components of naval power. Nations raced to build fleets of these underwater vessels, each design iteration adding range, adding speed, adding the ability to stay submerged longer, to dive deeper, to carry more weapons and more crew into the contested waters where empires met and clashed. The early submarines of this era were still uncomfortable machines, cramped and cold, smelling of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies and the particular metallic tang that comes from breathing recycled air. Crews learned to move carefully in the confined spaces, to speak quietly, to develop routines that allowed dozens of men to exist in a tube barely wider than a railway car, sharing bunks in rotation, eating meals in shifts, their lives governed by the rhythm of watches and the subtle creaks and groans of the pressure hull. World War I arrived, and with it came the first large-scale use of submarines in combat, the German U-boats prowling the Atlantic, hunting merchant ships and warships alike, demonstrating that these vessels could strangle an island nation's supply lines, could sink tonnage faster than it could be replaced, could force entire fleets to alter their routes and tactics to avoid an enemy they could not see. The U-boat crews developed techniques that would define submarine warfare for generations. They learned to attack at night on the surface, where their low profile made them nearly invisible, where they could use their deck guns to save precious torpedoes. They learned to dive quickly when aircraft appeared overhead, to hide in thermoclines where sonar signals scattered and confused, to move silently when hunters drew near, barely breathing, machinery reduced to minimal operation, every man aware that a single dropped tool or careless footstep might reveal their position. The Allied powers responded with convoys, with depth charges, with listening devices that tried to pick out the sound of propellers and engines from the ambient noise of the ocean, and the cat-and-mouse game intensified. Submarines lurking beneath convoy routes, destroyers zigzagging above, explosions sending columns of water skyward as depth charges detonated at preset depths, sometimes crushing a submarine's hull, sometimes missing by yards, the men inside never certain whether the next explosion would be the one that found them. I imagine the tension of those moments, the submarine running silent, all non-essential systems shut down, the crew frozen at their stations, listening to the ping of active sonar sweeping through the water, each pulse a question that might be answered by an echo from the hull, and then the sound of propellers overhead, growing louder, passing directly above, and the terrible waiting as depth charges tumbled down through the water, their descent marked by sound, growing closer, and then the hammering concussion of the explosion, the lights flickering, the hull flexing, cork insulation raining down like snow, and everyone holding their breath, wondering if the seams would hold. Between the wars, submarine technology advanced rapidly. Diesel-electric propulsion became standard. Hulls were strengthened to allow deeper dives. Torpedo technology improved with magnetic detonators and wakeless electric motors. Nations experimented with different configurations, some building large fleet submarines capable of long-range patrols, others focusing on smaller coastal vessels. Each navy developing doctrine suited to its strategic needs and geographic circumstances. The Japanese built submarines that could carry small aircraft, folded and stored in watertight hangars on the deck, meant to be assembled and launched for reconnaissance missions thousands of miles from home waters. It was an audacious concept, blending technologies in ways that seemed to defy practical limitations, though in practice the aircraft were fragile and the launch procedures complex and time-consuming. The United States focused on large fleet submarines designed for Pacific operations, vessels capable of staying at sea for months, traveling thousands of miles to patrol Japanese shipping lanes. They were given creature comforts unheard of on other nations' submarines, air conditioning to cope with tropical heat, better food storage, more spacious crew quarters, recognizing that crew morale and effectiveness depended on more than just mechanical reliability. And then World War II began, and submarines once again became central to the conflict, but this time on a scale that dwarfed the previous war. Hundreds of submarines operating simultaneously across multiple oceans, the technology more mature, the tactics more refined, the stakes measured in millions of tons of shipping and thousands of lives. German U-boats operated in wolf packs, coordinated groups that shared intelligence and attacked convoys from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the escorts, creating chaos that allowed individual boats to slip in and launch torpedoes at close range, the night sky lit by burning ships, the water thick with oil and debris, survivors clinging to wreckage while submarines withdrew into darkness, already hunting for the next target. The Battle of the Atlantic became a statistical struggle. Allied shipyards racing to build cargo vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. German shipyards trying to build submarines faster than Allied forces could destroy them. The balance shifting back and forth as new technologies were introduced. Improved radar that could detect submarines on the surface at night. Better depth charges that could be set to detonate at varying depths. Acoustic homing torpedoes that followed the sound of a submarine's propellers. In the Pacific, American submarines conducted unrestricted warfare against Japanese shipping, sinking freighters carrying oil and raw materials, troop transports, tankers, fishing vessels, anything that contributed to Japan's ability to wage war. The submarines operating from bases in Pearl Harbor and Australia, crossing vast expanses of empty ocean to reach their patrol areas, sometimes spending weeks without seeing another vessel, just endless blue water and empty sky. The American crews developed their own culture, their own traditions. Submariners were volunteers, all of them, because no one would be forced into a service where death came by drowning in darkness if the hull breached, where escape was often impossible, where the choice to submerge was a choice to trust completely in the vessel and the crew and the mathematics of pressure and steel. They painted insignia on their conning towers, adopted nicknames, developed elaborate qualification rituals for new crew members who had to prove their knowledge of every system aboard, earn their dolphins, the badge that marked them as qualified submariners, men who could be trusted to respond correctly in an emergency, who knew where every valve was located, who understood how to keep the boat alive when things went wrong. And things did go wrong. Submarines were lost to depth charging, to running aground on uncharted reefs, to mechanical failure at depth, to mines, to friendly fire when recognition signals were missed. Each loss meant an entire crew gone, 50 or 60 or 80 men vanishing without a trace, their families receiving telegrams that said missing and then eventually presumed lost. The ocean keeping its secrets, some boats simply disappeared, sailed out on patrol and never returned. No distress calls, no wreckage found, just silence. And the families and fellow submariners left to wonder what happened in those final moments, whether it was quick, whether they had time to know they were dying, whether they fought to save the boat, or whether the end came too fast for anything but realization. The USS Wahoo became legendary for aggressive patrols, for pressing attacks even under heavy counterfire, for the sheer audacity of its commander, Dudley Mush Morton, who took the submarine into shallow harbors where larger ships couldn't follow, who surfaced to engage targets with deck guns, who pushed the crew and the boat to their limits, sinking ship after ship until the boat's final patrol, when it ventured into the Sea of Japan through mine-infested straits and never emerged. The USS Tang set records for tonnage sunk, for successful patrols, for the skill and daring of its crew, until its final mission, when one of its own torpedoes malfunctioned, circled back and struck the Tang, sinking the submarine, killing all but 9 of the crew, those 9 enduring a harrowing escape from the sunken boat, breathing from emergency equipment as they rose through 100 feet of water, some not making it, the survivors captured and held as prisoners until war's end. Technology continued to evolve even as the war raged. The Germans developed the Type 21 U-boat late in the conflict, a revolutionary design with a streamlined hull optimized for underwater speed rather than surface travel, massive battery capacity that allowed it to remain submerged for days, snorkel systems that let diesel engines run while the boat cruised just below the surface, drawing air through a tube, reducing the need to fully surface and expose itself to radar and aircraft. Only a handful of Type 21 boats became operational before the war ended, too late to change the outcome, but they pointed toward the future, toward submarines designed primarily as underwater vessels rather than submersible surface ships, toward boats that could dive deep and stay down, that could outrun surface pursuers while submerged. That represented a fundamental shift in how submarines would operate. The war ended with submarine technology on the cusp of transformation. Diesel-electric boats had reached their practical limits. They were fast on the surface but slow underwater. They could stay submerged for hours but not days. They needed to surface regularly to run engines and charge batteries, making them vulnerable to detection. And naval architects understood that the next generation would need to break free of these constraints. The immediate post-war years saw navies studying captured German technology, incorporating lessons learned from thousands of submarine patrols, analyzing what worked and what failed. The Americans and British and Soviets all building new boats that incorporated schnorkels, improved battery system, better hull designs, each incremental improvement extending range, endurance, capability, but the real revolution was already brewing in laboratories and drafting rooms, because engineers had access to a new power source, one that didn't need air to operate, that could run continuously for months or years, that could generate enormous amounts of energy from a small amount of fuel, nuclear power. And when that technology matured enough to fit inside a submarine hull, everything would change. The ocean would become a realm where vessels could remain submerged indefinitely, where the only limit was the endurance of the crew and the food stored aboard. The USS Nautilus launched in 1954, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, and with it, the fundamental nature of underwater vessels transformed. No longer were submarines limited by battery capacity or the need to breathe air through diesel engines. The reactor produced heat. Heat made steam. Steam drove turbines. And those turbines could run as long as the reactor had fuel, which meant years, not hours. Commander Eugene Wilkinson took the Nautilus to sea and sent a message that became historic in its simplicity. Underway on nuclear power. 4 words that marked the beginning of a new era, an era where submarines could circle the globe without surfacing, could maintain high speeds underwater for weeks at a time, could operate beneath the polar ice cap where diesel boats could never venture. In 1958, the Nautilus accomplished what had seemed impossible just years before. It traveled under the North Pole, navigating by inertial guidance systems because compasses behaved strangely near the magnetic pole, cruising through black water beneath ice that was sometimes hundreds of feet thick. The crew aware that if something went wrong, if the reactor failed or the hull breached, there would be no surfacing, no rescue, just the weight of ice above and the cold below. The journey took 4 days, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, a voyage that would have taken weeks or months through conventional routes, and when the Nautilus emerged into open water, it proved that submarines had become truly 3-dimensional vessels, no longer bound to the surface ocean, no longer dependent on access to air. Now they could use depth as both shield and highway, could hide in ocean layers, could approach coastlines from unexpected directions, could rewrite the assumptions that had governed naval strategy for centuries. Other nations rushed to develop their own nuclear submarines: the Soviet Union, Britain, France, China, each recognizing that conventional diesel-electric boats had become obsolete for strategic purposes, still useful for coastal defense and certain specialized missions, but unable to match the speed, endurance, and stealth of nuclear vessels. The submarines grew larger, much larger, because nuclear reactors and steam turbines required space, and because the strategic mission expanded beyond simple torpedo attacks. The boats became platforms for ballistic missiles, for cruise missiles, for sophisticated sonar arrays and electronic warfare equipment. Some submarines exceeded 400 feet in length, displaced thousands of tons, carried crews of over 150. The ballistic missile submarines represented a particular kind of power, a deterrent force that could hide anywhere in the world's oceans, each boat carrying missiles with nuclear warheads, capable of striking targets thousands of miles away. And because the submarines were nearly impossible to track once submerged, they created a credible second strike capability, ensuring that even if a nation's land-based weapons were destroyed in a first strike, the submarines could retaliate. These boats operated on patrols lasting 2 or 3 months. following predetermined routes through designated patrol areas, maintaining radio silence, surfacing only briefly to raise an antenna and receive encrypted messages, the rest of the time existing in isolation, cut off from news, from family, from any connection to the world above. Crews divided into two teams, one operating the boat while the other rested, rotating through watches that measured time in increments divorced from day and night. Life aboard became highly ritualized. Routines developed to maintain sanity and cohesion in an environment where every day looked exactly like the one before, where there were no windows, no natural light, no weather, just the constant hum of ventilation and machinery, the subtle vibrations of the reactor, the periodic drills that kept skills sharp, fire drills, flooding drills, emergency surface procedures practiced until they became muscle memory. The crew compartments improved from the cramped quarters of diesel boats, bunks with curtains for privacy, better food preparation facilities, recreational spaces where off-duty crew could read or watch movies or write letters that wouldn't be mailed until the patrol ended, small concessions to the reality that asking men to live in a tube for months required attention to psychological as well as physical needs. The attack submarines evolved differently, built for speed and stealth, for hunting other submarines and surface ships. They were smaller than the missile boats, more maneuverable, equipped with advanced sonar that could detect targets at enormous distances, could classify contacts by the unique acoustic signature of their machinery, could track multiple targets simultaneously while remaining undetected. These submarines played elaborate games with each other during the Cold War. American boats trailing Soviet submarines, Soviet boats trying to track American carriers, each side probing the other's capabilities, learning patrol patterns, recording acoustic signatures, the ocean becoming a three-dimensional chessboard where moves were measured in knots and fathoms and bearing changes too subtle for surface observers to notice. Sometimes the submarines came close, terrifyingly close, during tracking exercises or chance encounters. Boats passing within hundreds of feet, each crew aware of the other's presence, each commander making split-second decisions about how to maneuver without triggering an incident, without creating a situation that might escalate beyond anyone's control. The tension electric, every sonar operator listening intently, every officer calculating angles and speeds and trying to predict what the other submarine would do next. There were collisions, mostly minor, scrapes and bumps when boats misjudged distances or when one surfaced unexpectedly beneath another, and a few more serious, submarines damaged enough to require emergency surface, crews scrambling to control flooding or restore power. The incidents reported quietly, if at all, both sides preferring to keep their underwater activities secret, to maintain the mystery that gave submarines much of their strategic value. The technology continued advancing. Sonar became more sensitive, able to hear a submarine's passage from hundreds of miles away under the right conditions, able to distinguish a particular boat from its mechanical fingerprint, able to track through multiple ocean layers despite thermoclines and density gradients that bent sound in complex ways. And so submarines became quieter. Engineers redesigned propellers to reduce cavitation, mounted machinery on rubber isolators to prevent vibration from reaching the hull, covered the exterior with anechoic tiles that absorbed sonar pulses rather than reflecting them, developed new hull shapes that scattered sound, the vessels transforming into acoustic ghosts. so quiet that they became nearly impossible to detect unless they chose to reveal themselves. The dive depth increased. Improved steel alloys and better welding techniques allowed submarines to operate at depths that would have crushed earlier vessels. Some boats could dive below 2,000 feet, entering realms where the pressure exceeded 600 pounds per square inch, where any failure of the hull meant instant catastrophe, the ocean rushing in with such force that death would come too quickly for comprehension. The crews trained for emergencies they hoped never to face, trained to fight fires in spaces where smoke had nowhere to go, to control flooding when water entered under pressure that could cut through flesh, to surface a damaged boat from depth and using emergency blow systems that forced high-pressure air into ballast tanks, driving water out, creating buoyancy, fighting against tons of water that wanted to keep the boat down. Accidents happened despite the training, despite the redundant systems and careful procedures. Submarines were lost to fires, to flooding, to reactor accidents, to collisions with underwater mountains or with other vessels, each loss devastating, each investigation revealing some combination of equipment, failure, and human error and simple bad luck, and each loss leading to new safety measures, new training protocols, new equipment, the price of experience paid in lives. The Russian submarine Kursk sank in the year 2000 during a training exercise, an explosion in the torpedo room, possibly from a leaking torpedo, possibly from other causes. The blast so powerful it registered on seismographs, the submarine settling to the bottom in relatively shallow water. Some crew surviving in aft compartments, waiting for rescue that came too late. The disaster revealing limitations in rescue equipment and coordination, becoming a tragedy that nations studied to improve their own procedures. But submarines also saved lives, conducted rescue missions, evacuated civilians from conflict zones, supported scientific research, mapped the ocean floor, studied marine life, laid undersea cables, recovered lost equipment from impossible depths, proving their versatility, their value beyond military applications. Research submarines descended to the deepest parts of the ocean, specially designed bathyscaphes that could withstand the crushing pressure of the Mariana Trench, nearly 7 miles down, where the pressure exceeds 15,000 pounds per square inch, where the darkness is absolute, where life exists in forms adapted to extremes that seem incompatible with biology, tube worms and strange fish, and creatures that generate their own light. The military submarines continued their patrols, maintaining the deterrent balance, tracking adversaries, gathering intelligence, surfacing only when necessary, their crews seeing sunlight for brief moments before diving again, returning to the perpetual twilight of operational depth, to the world of sonar and periscope and navigation by instruments, trusting the machinery, trusting each other, carrying out missions that might never be acknowledged, that existed in classified files and personal memory, that shaped global events in ways the public would never fully understand. And as the decades passed, as the Cold War ended and new challenges emerged, the submarines adapted, new missions, new technologies, new generations of crew. But the fundamental experience remained, the descent into pressure and darkness, the isolation, the peculiar intimacy of living in close quarters with people whose competence meant the difference between life and death, the slow passage of time marked by watches and meals, and the distance traveled beneath an ocean that continued its movements regardless of human presence. The newest submarines incorporated technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to the crews of the Nautilus or the earlier diesel boats: fiber optic systems, advanced computers, automated controls, weapons that could be programmed to seek targets autonomously, sensors that could create three-dimensional maps of the ocean environment. Yet the basic mission remained unchanged: to move unseen through the water, to gather information or project power, to be present where others did not expect, to serve as a reminder that the ocean's depths were not empty, that invisibility did not mean absence. And there is something profound in this history, something that speaks to more than naval strategy or technological achievement. It speaks to the human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to thrive in environments fundamentally hostile to our existence, for creating pockets of breathable atmosphere and livable space in realms where we have no natural right to be. The submarine crews learned to read their vessel the way a sailor reads the sea, by sound and vibration and subtle changes in how the boat responded to controls. They could tell when something was wrong before instruments confirmed it, could hear the difference between normal operation and the first whisper of malfunction, their senses attuned to machinery in ways that went beyond training, becoming intuitive, almost instinctual. They developed a language of their own, terms that meant nothing to surface sailors: angles and bubbles, trim and ballast, blowing tanks and flooding tubes, words that described the precise manipulation of weight and buoyancy that kept the boat at the desired depth, that allowed it to hover motionless in mid-water, or rise gently toward the surface, or sink bow first into the dark. And they learned silence, not just the operational silence required to avoid detection, but a deeper quietness, a comfort with being alone with their thoughts for hours at a time. Watches spent monitoring instruments, listening to sonar, maintaining the slow rhythm of patrol, time expanding and contracting in ways that made days blur together, that made the world outside the hull seem increasingly abstract, increasingly distant. The ocean itself became a presence, not just water and pressure, but a living environment. They heard whales singing, heard shrimp colonies crackling like distant fire, heard the deep scattering layer rising and falling with the daily migration of plankton and small fish, the biological rhythms of the sea continuing regardless of human presence, oblivious to the steel tubes passing through. Sometimes the submarines would encounter bioluminescent organisms, and the crew would watch through the periscope as the bow wave created cascades of light, tiny creatures responding to disturbance by flashing, turning the water into liquid stars, a private light show witnessed by those who had descended into darkness, a reminder that even in the deepest ocean, even where sunlight never penetrates, there is light of a different kind. The psychological studies of submariners revealed interesting patterns. Most adapted well to the isolation and confinement, found the routine comforting, the clear hierarchy, the certainty of procedure. Some reported that patrol time felt almost meditative, that the absence of external stimulation created a mental clarity difficult to achieve on land, that the focus required by the mission left no room for the usual anxieties and distractions of daily life. Others struggled, felt the walls pressing in, felt time stretching unbearably, counted days until patrol's end, but even they usually completed their missions, supported by crewmates who understood, who had perhaps felt the same way on previous patrols, who knew that the best response was patience and routine and the quiet solidarity of the shared experience. The families of submariners developed their own coping mechanisms, knowing their loved ones were at sea but unable to communicate, waiting for the patrol to end, for the submarine to return to port, for the reunion that came with relief and joy, and the knowledge that soon another patrol would begin, another separation, the cycle repeating for years, for careers, for generations. Children grew up knowing their father or mother disappeared for months at a time into a world they could barely imagine, returned changed in subtle ways, quieter, more distant for a few days before readjusting to life on land, to noise and weather and the chaotic unpredictability of surface existence. And then the cycle would begin again, the preparation for the next patrol, the slow mental shift from shore life back to submarine routine. The technology advanced, but the human element remained constant. Someone still had to make decisions, to interpret sensor data, to respond when systems failed, to maintain morale, to keep the boat running through storms and equipment breakdowns and the endless monotony of successful patrols where nothing went wrong and nothing happened beyond the steady accumulation of miles traveled and time submerged. And perhaps that is the deeper story, not the machinery or the weapons or the strategic importance, but the people who chose this life, who volunteered to seal themselves in steel and descend into an environment where every breath depended on systems functioning correctly, where every moment carried the awareness that the ocean waited patiently for any mistake, any weakness, any failure of mettle or judgment. They were scientists of a sort, conducting ongoing experiments in human endurance and adaptation, testing the limits of what could be achieved when people worked together in extreme conditions, when individual survival depended absolutely on collective competence, when there was no calling for help, no easy escape, just the crew and the boat and the mission. The submarines themselves became repositories of knowledge, each boat developing its own personality, its own quirks and tendencies. Veterans knew which valve stuck, which gauge read slightly high, which compartment always felt colder than the others. And this knowledge passed from crew to crew, unofficial but essential, the kind of understanding that came only from experience, from time spent learning the vessel's rhythms. And in the accumulation of small details and hard-won insights, the submarines became more than machines. They became partners in a venture that required trust from both sides, the crew trusting the boat to protect them, the boat, if such a thing can be said, depending on the crew to maintain it, to operate it within safe parameters, to respect the limits imposed by physics and engineering. The tradition continues. New submarines slide down ways in shipyards around the world, incorporating technologies their designers from decades past could not have imagined, automated systems, advanced materials, weapons of terrifying sophistication, but crewed by people who would be recognizable to those early submariners, people willing to embrace the challenge, to accept the risks, to find meaning in service beneath the waves. They still feel the thrill of diving, the slight downward angle as ballast tanks flood, the sense of weight increasing as the boat slips below the surface, the moment when the hull is fully submerged and the outside world disappears, replaced by the interior reality of the submarine. its sounds and smells, and the knowledge that they have entered a different realm, one where the rules change, where survival requires constant attention, constant care. And when the patrol ends, when the submarine rises toward the surface for the final time, breaking through into air and light, the crew experiences something that never quite becomes routine, the return to a world of horizons and weather, of color and variation, of connection to the larger human community from which they temporarily separated themselves. The hatch opens. Fresh air floods in, replacing the recycled atmosphere they have breathed for weeks or months. And they climb out onto the deck, feeling wind on their faces, seeing sky, readjusting to the simple reality of standing in open air, no longer enclosed, no longer dependent on machinery for every breath, but part of them remains below, in the memories of quiet watches and distant sonar contacts, in the camaraderie of shared experience that cannot quite be explained to those who have never served, in the knowledge of what it means to trust completely, to depend absolutely, to function as part of something larger than individual capability. The ocean keeps its submarines now, hundreds of them, wrecks scattered across the seafloor, from the Hunley lying in shallow water to boats lost in the deep trenches. Each one a time capsule, a memorial to the crews who served, some lost in combat, some in accidents, some simply vanishing, the causes unknown, the final moments unrecorded, joining the countless ships and sailors the ocean has claimed across all of human history. And still the submarines sail, still they dive, still they carry their crews into depths where light fades and pressure builds, still they fulfill missions both public and classified. Still they represent one of humanity's more audacious achievements, the conquest not of the ocean surface, but of its depths, the transformation of an environment fundamentally inhospitable to human life into a one where we can operate for extended periods, protected by metal and mathematics, by training and trust. The story continues. New chapters being written in patrol logs and engineering reports, in the quiet professionalism of crews maintaining watch, in the slow evolution of technology and doctrine, but the essential narrative remains unchanged. People descending into the deep, moving through darkness, returning to light, carrying forward a tradition that began with dreamers sketching impossible vessels that continued through centuries of experiment and tragedy, that persists in the submarines cruising beneath the ocean's surface at this very moment, unseen, largely unknown, but present, always present, and perhaps that is enough to know that the ocean's depths are inhabited, not permanently, not naturally, but through human will and ingenuity, that we have extended our reach into realms that seemed forever beyond us, and in doing so have discovered not just strategic advantage or scientific knowledge, but something about ourselves, about what we are capable of when we commit fully, when we trust completely, when we venture into the unknown and find ways not just to survive, but to thrive. The submarines continue their silent passage through cold water and warm, through calm seas and storms that rage above while they glide unaffected below. And in that passage, in that continuation of purpose, the story persists, echoing through the vastness, a whisper in the deep, a testament to vision and courage, fading now into the gentle rhythm of waves, into the slow current, into the eternal darkness where pressure and cold reign, and where somehow, improbably, humans learn to dwell. I imagine a theater in twilight, not a grand modern hall with bright marquees and bustling crowds, but something older, something quieter, a space where wooden beams creak softly overhead and dust motes drift through shafts of fading light, filtering down from high windows that haven't been cleaned in decades, perhaps centuries. The air here feels different, heavier somehow, as though it holds the memory of every voice that ever echoed from its stage, every whispered line, every grand soliloquy, every moment of revelation that passed between the players and those who came to witness. Outside these walls, the world continues its endless turning, but here, in this particular pocket of existence, time seems to move at a different pace entirely, moving through layers of history like fingers trailing through water, touching briefly on moments that shaped how we see ourselves, how we understand the human experience through the strange alchemy of performance. There's something almost sacred about an empty theater, the way shadows pool in the corners of the stage, the way a single candle or lantern can transform bare boards into any place imaginable, a palace in Denmark, a forest outside Athens, the streets of Verona, where ancient grudges breed new mutiny. I find myself thinking about the people who made these transformations possible, not the actors alone, though they were essential, but the ones who put words into their mouths, who dreamed entire worlds into being with nothing but language and imagination, the playwrights who understood that theater was more than entertainment, that it was a mirror held up to nature, a way of examining what it means to be alive. They worked in different eras, different countries, under different circumstances entirely, some writing for kings and queens in candle-lit chambers, others for groundlings standing in the mud of outdoor playhouses, still others for drawing rooms where polite society gathered to see itself reflected, sometimes flattered, sometimes challenged, always observed. These writers understood something fundamental about human nature, that we are creatures who need stories, who gather around fires or footlights to hear our own experiences transformed into something larger, something that resonates beyond the particular and into the universal. I think about how a playwright's work differs from other forms of writing. A novel can luxuriate in description, can slip inside a character's thoughts and remain there for pages, painting interior landscapes with exquisite detail, but a play must live entirely in dialogue and action, in what can be seen and heard, what can be embodied by human beings, standing before other human beings in shared space. This limitation became in the hands of masters, not a constraint, but a kind of freedom, forcing them to distill human experience down to its essence, to find ways of revealing character through speech and gesture alone, to trust that an audience would lean forward in their seats and fill in what couldn't be shown, participating in the creation of meaning. The greatest of these writers developed distinct voices, recognizable styles that set them apart, yet they all shared certain qualities, an understanding of dramatic structure, of how tension builds and releases, of when to offer comic relief and when to press deeper into tragedy, of how a single line, perfectly placed, can illuminate an entire character, or shift the direction of a story completely. Some of them changed the very language we speak, coined phrases that outlived their plays and became part of everyday conversation, proof that a theater, when done well, doesn't remain confined to the stage, but seeps out into the world, shaping how we think and express ourselves generations later. Others revolutionized theatrical form itself, broke conventions that seemed unbreakable, showed that plays could be longer or shorter, funnier or darker, more realistic or more abstract than anyone had imagined, each innovation opening doors for those who followed. I imagine these figures now, separated by centuries and continents, yet connected by their shared craft, by their dedication to capturing human truth in dramatic form. And I wonder what it was like for each of them, sitting alone with quill or pen, watching characters come alive on the page, hearing voices that no one else could hear yet, voices that would soon fill theaters and echo down through time. The theater in my mind grows darker now, the last light fading from those high windows, but there's a kind of beauty in this dimness, the way it allows imagination to take over completely, the way a bare stage becomes infinite, capable of containing any story, any world, any vision that a playwright dares to dream into existence. The story begins, as so many stories do, in ancient Greece, where theater itself was born from religious festivals honoring Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy and transformation, where entire communities gathered on hillsides carved into natural amphitheaters, stone seats rising in perfect semicircles to hold thousands of citizens who came to witness something sacred. In those early days, around the 5th century before the Common Era, drama was not mere entertainment, but civic duty, a way for the city-state to examine itself, to grapple with questions of justice and fate, and the relationship between mortals and gods. And 3 names emerge from this distant time, like pillars supporting everything that would come after. Aeschylus, the first whose works survive, a man who had fought at Marathon and Salamis, who had seen the Persian Wars reshape the Greek world, brought that experience of conflict and consequence to the stage, creating tragedies that explored how human choices ripple outward, how the sins of fathers fall upon children, how justice, when pursued too zealously, can become indistinguishable from revenge. His plays were grand affairs, employing only 2 actors plus a chorus. Yet within those constraints he built monuments of dramatic art. The Oresteia remains the only complete trilogy we possess from ancient Greece. 3 plays that trace a curse through generations, from Agamemnon's murder by his wife Clytemnestra, to their son Orestes' terrible choice between avenging his father and sparing his mother, to the final resolution in an Athenian court where human law replaces the endless cycle of blood vengeance. Aeschylus understood that theater could hold vast ideas, could make visible the invisible forces that shape human destiny. His choruses spoke in language that was dense and poetic, often difficult even for ancient audiences, but that difficulty was intentional, demanding that spectators work to extract meaning, to engage actively with the moral questions being posed. Then came Sophocles, younger, more interested in the psychology of individuals than in cosmic justice. He added a 3rd actor to the stage, allowing for more complex interactions, more nuanced revelations of character. And he wrote, by ancient accounts, over 120 plays, though only 7 complete tragedies survive the centuries. Among these, Oedipus Rex stands as perhaps the most perfectly constructed drama in Western literature, a story everyone in the audience already knew, the tale of a man who killed his father and married his mother, yet Sophocles made them feel every moment of discovery as though it were new, building tension through dramatic irony, through the terrible gap between what the audience knows and what Oedipus believes. The play moves with the inevitability of a mathematical proof. Each attempt Oedipus makes to escape his fate only draws him closer to the truth he's fleeing. Each witness he calls to prove his innocence instead confirms his guilt, until finally he stands alone, self-blinded, exiled, transformed from the solver of riddles who saved Thebes to a riddle himself, a warning about the limits of human knowledge and the dangers of hubris. Sophocles wrote with grace and clarity, his language less ornate than Aeschylus, but no less powerful, finding beauty in simplicity, creating characters who felt fully human even as they moved through mythic narratives. His Antigone, defying her uncle's edict to leave her brother's body unburied, remains one of literature's great portraits of moral courage, of choosing divine law over human authority, even when it means certain death. The third great tragedian was Euripides, the youngest of this triumvirate, and the most controversial, a playwright who questioned everything his predecessors had established, who took the old myths and twisted them, showing the gods as petty and cruel, heroes as flawed and selfish, women as complex beings with inner lives and valid grievances against a male-dominated society. His Medea shocked Athenian audiences, presenting a foreign woman, a barbarian by Greek standards, as the play's center, giving her eloquent speeches about the injustices women endure, then showing her commit the ultimate transgression, murdering her own children to punish her unfaithful husband Jason. Euripides didn't ask his audience to approve of Medea's actions, but he forced them to understand the rage that drove her, to see her not as a monster, but as a human being pushed beyond endurance. The Bacchae, possibly his final play, returned to Dionysus, the god in whose honor these dramas were performed, but presented him as a force of terrifying power, capable of driving mortals mad, of making mothers tear their own sons apart in ecstatic frenzy. It was a warning, perhaps, about the dangers of denying the irrational aspects of human nature, of pretending reason alone could govern our lives. These 3 men, writing within decades of each other, established tragedy as an art form, created works that would be studied and imitated and argued over for millennia. But they weren't alone on the Athenian stage. Comedy flourished there as well, and one name dominates the comedic tradition of that era, Aristophanes, whose plays were raucous and obscene and politically pointed, filled with talking animals and flying heroes and gods brought low. He used the freedom of comedy to attack public figures by name, to mock Athens's military adventures, to propose absurd solutions to real problems. In Lysistrata, the women of Greece end the Peloponnesian War by refusing to sleep with their husbands until peace is declared, a premise that allowed for endless bawdy jokes while making a serious point about the senselessness of perpetual conflict. His comedy was physical, verbal, often crude by modern standards, but beneath the laughs lay sharp social commentary. The clouds mocked Socrates and the new sophistic education, The frogs descended into the underworld to judge a contest between Aeschylus and Euripides, between old and new styles of tragedy. Aristophanes himself clearly preferring the grand moral certainties of Aeschylus to what he saw as Euripides' corrosive questioning. These Greek playwrights worked within strict formal constraints, the chorus that never left the stage, the limitation on actors, the requirement that violence happen off stage and be reported rather than shown, the unity of time and action that kept plays focused and intense. Yet within these boundaries they achieved extraordinary range, from the cosmic scale of Prometheus Bound, with its Titan chained to a rock for stealing fire from the gods, to the intimate domestic tragedy of Euripides' Alcestis, where a wife agrees to die in her husband's place. They wrote for specific occasions, the dramatic festivals where playwrights competed for prizes, where wealthy citizens funded productions as a form of public service, where attendance was not just entertainment, but religious observance and civic participation. The theater held the entire community, rich and poor, citizens and foreigners, though not in those early days, women, who were represented on stage by male actors in masks, but not permitted to watch or perform. The plays themselves were performed only once or rarely, making each performance a unique event. There were no permanent records, no way to experience a drama except by being present when it was staged, which gave the theater an urgency, an immediacy that's difficult to imagine in our age of recordings and revivals. And then, for centuries, the tradition seemed to die. Rome produced playwrights like Seneca, who adapted Greek tragedies, making them more violent, more rhetorical, but these were likely closet dramas, meant for reading rather than performance. And Plautus and Terence wrote comedies based on Greek New Comedy, domestic farces about mistaken identities and young lovers. But nothing matched the achievement of Athens' Golden Age. The medieval period saw theater reborn from religious ritual, mystery plays that dramatized biblical stories, morality plays that personified virtues and vices, performed in churches and town squares, anonymous works, collective creations rather than the vision of individual playwrights, fascinating in their own right, but not yet what we think of as authored drama, as literature meant for the stage. The Renaissance would change everything, would see theater explode across Europe in new forms. But that transformation was still centuries away, and the Greek playwrights remained, their works preserved in manuscripts, studied by scholars, waiting for the moment when theater would rise again. That moment arrived in England in the late 16th century, when London was transforming from a medieval city into something more complex, more cosmopolitan, a place where theaters were being built for the first time as permanent structures, not temporary stages in inn-yards or noble houses, but dedicated spaces where plays could be performed daily, where audiences could gather by the hundreds, standing in the pit or sitting in the galleries, drawn by the promise of stories both familiar and strange. The theaters themselves were architectural marvels in their own right, circular or polygonal wooden structures, open to the sky, with a stage that thrust out into the crowd, creating an intimacy between performers and spectators. No barrier of orchestra pit or proscenium arch, just bodies breathing the same air, sharing the same afternoon light. the same sudden darkness when clouds passed overhead. Christopher Marlowe arrived in this world like a comet, burning bright and brief, a shoemaker's son who went to Cambridge on scholarship, who may have worked as a spy, who certainly lived wildly, wrote urgently, and died violently in a tavern brawl at 29, stabbed through the eye under circumstances that remain disputed, his killer claiming self-defense, some historians suspecting political assassination, but before that end, Marlowe revolutionized English drama. He took the rigid lines of earlier plays, their mechanical rhythms and predictable rhymes, and unleashed what Ben Jonson would later call Marlowe's mighty line, blank verse that rolled and thundered, that could contain enormous ideas and fierce passions, that made language itself a kind of action. His Tamburlaine, the great, presented a shepherd who conquers the known world through sheer force of will, speaking in poetry that matched his ambition, vast and glittering and relentless. Marlowe didn't apologize for his protagonist's cruelty or try to moralize his violence. He simply showed power in its most naked form, and audiences were electrified. They had never heard anything like this on an English stage. Dr. Faustus followed, the story of a scholar who sells his soul to the devil for 24 years of supernatural power. And Marlowe made those years feel simultaneously endless and fleeting, filled with conjuring tricks and theological debates, with comedy and horror intertwined, until the final scene when Faustus faces damnation, when the clock strikes midnight and demons come to collect their prize, and he delivers one of drama's most harrowing speeches, begging time to slow, to stop, to give him just one more moment of existence before he's dragged to hell. The Jew of Malta and Edward II showed different facets of Marlowe's genius, his ability to create complex villains who were more interesting than virtuous characters, his willingness to depict forbidden desires, homoerotic love and religious hypocrisy and political machinations, all rendered in language that made the transgressive seem inevitable, even necessary. Marlowe died in 1593, just as another playwright was beginning to overshadow him. Though the two may have collaborated, may have been rivals, may have been friends, the historical record preserves so little about their relationship. But William Shakespeare, born the same year as Marlowe, would take what Marlowe had begun and build something even more extraordinary. Shakespeare came from Stratford-upon-Avon, a market town in Warwickshire, his father a glover and local official who fell on hard times. William married young Anne Hathaway, 8 years his senior, already pregnant when they wed. 3 children followed, and then, somehow, Shakespeare made his way to London, joined a theater company, began acting, began writing. The early plays show him learning his craft, imitating Marlowe's grand style, writing histories about English kings that were really commentaries on contemporary politics, exploring how power corrupts, how civil war tears nations apart, how leadership requires both strength and wisdom. Richard III gave audiences a villain protagonist who reveled in his own evil, soliloquizing directly to the crowd, making them complicit in his schemes even as they were horrified by his actions. Romeo and Juliet took a familiar Italian tale and made it achingly immediate. 2 teenagers falling in love across a family feud, speaking to each other in shared sonnets. Their romance doomed not by fate alone, but by the stupidity of adults who refused to end their meaningless grudge. The play balanced poetry and violence, comedy and tragedy, Mercutio's wit and the nurse's earthiness grounding the lovers' idealism, making their deaths feel like a waste, a preventable tragedy that shames everyone who survives them. A Midsummer Night's Dream showed Shakespeare's gift for comedy, for weaving multiple plots together, aristocratic lovers fleeing to the forest, where fairy royalty quarrels over a stolen child, where a group of craftsmen rehearses a play, and magic turns a weaver into a donkey. And by morning, nothing is quite as it was, except that it is the chaos resolved, the marriages arranged, everything returned to order, but with a sense that the wildness of the wood is always there, just beyond the city walls, waiting. Then came the great tragedies, the period when Shakespeare seemed to peer into the darkest corners of human experience and emerge with works of devastating beauty. Hamlet, the prince who cannot decide whether to avenge his father's murder, who questions everything, the nature of death, the purpose of life, the reliability of ghosts, and the trustworthiness of uncles, who stages a play within the play to catch the conscience of the king, who accidentally kills the wrong man and drives Ophelia mad with grief, who finally acts only when it's too late, when everyone he loves is dead or dying. The play is impossibly long, probably never performed in full, even in Shakespeare's time, yet every scene feels necessary. Every speech reveals something new about its speaker. Hamlet himself is somehow both a specific character and a mirror. Audiences see themselves in his doubts, his delays, his sudden violence, his bitter jokes, and his genuine grief. Othello presented jealousy as a kind of poison, introduced drop by Iago, the ensign who resents being passed over for promotion and so destroys everyone around him. Shakespeare made Othello a Moor, nay, an outsider in Venetian society, a military hero who never quite belongs, whose marriage to Desdemona is questioned by her father, by the state, by Othello himself, once Iago begins whispering suggestions, intimations, possibilities that grow into certainties despite having no foundation. The tragedy unfolds with mechanical precision, each piece falling into place until Othello smothers his innocent wife and then, learning the truth, kills himself rather than live with what he's done. King Lear stripped away everything comfortable, presented an old king dividing his kingdom among his daughters, disowning the one who truly loves him, rewarding the two who flatter him with false declarations, and then, when those two daughters betray him, casting him out into a storm. The play descended into something primal, Lear raging on the heath, accompanied by a fool who speaks truth through riddles, by a nobleman disguised as a beggar. The social order collapsed entirely, left only suffering and madness, and occasional moments of tenderness between characters who had nothing left to lose. Macbeth explored ambition, how a brave warrior, hearing a prophecy that he'll be a king, allows that possibility to consume him, encouraged by his wife, who is even more ambitious, more willing to push past moral boundaries. They murder the sleeping king, seize the throne, then discover that power gained through murder must be maintained through more murders, until Macbeth becomes the tyrant he once fought against, until Lady Macbeth, who seemed so strong, is destroyed by guilt, walking in her sleep, trying to wash invisible blood from her hands, until the prophecy completes itself in ways they never anticipated. These plays were performed in daylight, with minimal scenery, the words creating every setting, every mood, actors speaking directly to the audience, making them confidants and witnesses. The Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare's company performed, held perhaps 3,000 people, merchants and apprentices and nobles all mixed together, eating nuts and drinking ale, heckling or cheering, demanding their money back if they were disappointed. Shakespeare wrote for these audiences, for their taste for violence and comedy mixed together, for their love of wordplay, puns, and double meanings that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. He wrote for specific actors, too. We can trace through his plays how his company's personnel changed, how a new boy actor inspired him to write more complex female roles, how the company clown's style evolved from improvised physical comedy to scripted philosophical banter. But he also wrote for something larger, some ideal audience that existed in his imagination, capable of following the most intricate metaphors, of catching subtle echoes between scenes separated by acts, of holding contradictory ideas in tension. His plays refuse easy interpretation. Shylock in The Merchant of Venice is both villain and victim. His famous speech claiming common humanity with Christians is genuinely moving, even as the play itself seems ambivalent about whether he deserves mercy or punishment. The late romances, Cymbeline and The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, showed Shakespeare experimenting with form, mixing tragedy and comedy in new ways, allowing for reconciliation rather than death, for forgiveness rather than revenge. The Tempest, possibly his final solo work, presented Prospero, the wronged duke, marooned on an island where he's learned magic, where he controls spirits, where he finally has the chance to punish his enemies when they're shipwrecked on his shore. But instead, after putting them through trials, he chooses mercy, chooses to break his staff and drown his book, to return to the human world and its limitations. Shakespeare died in 1616, on his birthday according to tradition, having written, by most counts, 37 plays, plus sonnets and longer poems, works that were performed but not always published in his lifetime, gathered into the first folio 7 years after his death by fellow actors who wanted to preserve what might otherwise have been lost. The generation that follows Shakespeare continued exploring what drama could be, what it could say about human nature and society. Ben Jonson, who had been an actor and a soldier, who killed a man in a duel and escaped hanging by pleading benefit of clergy, brought classical learning to the English stage, wrote comedies that were more structured, more satirical than Shakespeare's, concerned with exposing human folly through precisely observed types. His Volpone presented a wealthy Venetian pretending to be dying, watching as greedy men offer him gifts and flatter him, hoping to be named his heir, each one degrading himself further, willing to sacrifice family, honor, dignity for the promise of gold. Jonson made vice entertaining even as he condemned it. His characters spoke in language that was dense and witty, packed with classical allusions, demonstrating that comedy could be as intellectually demanding as tragedy. The alchemist trapped 3 con artists in a house during a plague, where they bilked customers seeking the philosopher's stone, sexual satisfaction, advantageous marriages, whatever fantasy each mark desired. The plot grew more complex with each scene, lies building on lies, until the structure collapsed in glorious chaos. Jonson understood that comedy came from watching intelligent people construct elaborate schemes that fall apart through their own cleverness, John Webster wrote tragedies that were darker, more violent than even Shakespeare had attempted. The Duchess of Malfi presented a widow who dared to remarry below her station, who was tortured by her brothers for this transgression, driven mad by being shown wax figures of her murdered children, yet maintaining her dignity even as she was strangled. Webster's world was one where virtue offered no protection, where the innocent suffered alongside the guilty, where death came arbitrarily and often. The White Devil explored similar territory, adultery and murder among Italian nobility, characters who were neither purely good nor purely evil, but complex mixtures of desire and conscience. Webster wrote in images that were startling, visceral. His characters spoke of death and corruption in language that made those abstractions feel immediate, tangible, present in the theater like a fourth wall pressing in on the audience. These Jacobean playwrights, writing after Elizabeth's death, when James I took the throne, seemed drawn to darkness, to exposing the rot beneath civilized surfaces. John Ford's "'Tis pity she's a whore" confronted incest between brother and sister. Thomas Middleton's The Revenger's tragedy reveled in elaborate schemes of vengeance. The theater became a place where forbidden subjects could be examined, where social criticism could hide behind historical settings or foreign locations. But then, in 1642, Parliament closed all the theaters, the Puritan government viewing drama as immoral, corrupting, a distraction from godly living. For 18 years, an entire generation, there were no public performances in England, no new plays written for the stage. Actors fled to the continent or found other work. Theaters fell into disrepair or were demolished. When the theaters reopened after the Restoration, when Charles II returned from exile in 1660, everything had changed. The new playhouses were indoor spaces, candle-lit, with painted scenery and artificial perspective, with women performing female roles for the first time on English stages. The plays themselves were different, too. Comedies of manners that satirized fashionable society, heroic dramas in rhymed couplets that now seem stilted, but then represented the height of sophistication. William Wycherley and William Congreve wrote comedies about rakish aristocrats and clever women, about marriage as a social contract rather than romantic union. The Country Wife and The Way of the World sparkled with wit, characters trading elaborate insults and testing each other's intelligence through wordplay. But beneath the surface charm lay genuine cynicism about human relationships, about the games people played to secure money and status. Across the Channel, France had developed its own dramatic tradition. Pierre Corneille wrote tragedies that explored duty and honor. Le Cid presented a hero torn between love and obligation, between his heart and his principles. The play caused enormous controversy. Critics argued it violated neoclassical rules about unity of time and place, about moral instruction. Corneille defended his work, sparked debates about the purpose of theater that raged for years. Jean Racine perfected the French classical style, writing tragedies that were spare, elegant, focused on psychological suffering rather than external action. Phèdre, his masterpiece, presented a woman consumed by illicit passion for her stepson, fighting against her desires, knowing they were wrong, unable to stop herself. The play unfolded with the inevitability of Greek tragedy, but in language that was purely French, Alexandrine verse that seemed both natural and elevated. Molière brought comedy to heights it hadn't reached since Aristophanes, writing and acting in his own plays, creating satires that targeted religious hypocrisy, medical quackery, social climbing, aristocratic pretension. Tartuffe presented a con man posing as a holy man, taking over a household through his supposed piety, seducing the master's wife while denouncing pleasure and preaching abstinence. The play was banned for years, religious authorities claiming it mocked faith itself, though Molière insisted he only mocked those who used faith as a mask. The misanthrope created a protagonist who couldn't stand human dishonesty, who insisted on brutal honesty in all situations, making himself miserable and everyone around him uncomfortable. Molière showed that virtue taken to extremes became vice, that society required some degree of politeness, of white lies and social lubrication. His comedies were physical and verbal simultaneously, pratfalls and witty dialogue combined. He understood that laughter came from recognition, from seeing our own flaws magnified on stage. The 18th century saw theater spread and transform further in England. Richard Brinsley Sheridan wrote, "The School for Scandal," a comedy about gossip and reputation that remains sparkling entertainment. Oliver Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer played with mistaken identities and class assumptions. These were lighter works than the Restoration comedies, more good-natured, less cynical about human nature. But the most significant theatrical development of that century happened in Germany, where Gotthold Ephraim Lessing argued for a new kind of drama, one that wasn't bound by French neoclassical rules, that could learn from Shakespeare's freedom, his mixing of comedy and tragedy, his willingness to span years and continents within a single play. Lessing wrote Nathan the Wise, a plea for religious tolerance, set in Jerusalem during the Crusades, presenting Muslim, Christian, and Jewish characters as equally capable of wisdom and folly. Friedrich Schiller took up this call, writing historical dramas that were epic in scope. The Robbers presented two brothers, one noble and idealistic, one scheming and corrupt. Don Carlos explored political intrigue in the Spanish court, religious persecution, forbidden love. Schiller wrote in language that was grand, rhetorical, designed to stir audiences to think about freedom and justice and human dignity. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, primarily known as a poet and novelist, wrote Faust, a dramatic poem in two parts that was perhaps never meant to be fully staged, too long, too complex, too cosmic in its ambitions. It took the old legend of the scholar who sold his soul and expanded it into an exploration of everything, knowledge and power, love and politics, art and commerce, redemption and damnation. Goethe worked on it for 60 years, from his youth into old age, and it remains a monument of world literature even if it defies conventional theatrical production. The 19th century brought new movements, new ideas about what theater should be. Romanticism emphasized emotion over reason, individual experience over social convention. Victor Hugo in France wrote Hernani, a play whose opening night sparked riots between classical and romantic factions, audiences fighting in the aisles over questions of dramatic form, whether theater should maintain neoclassical decorum or embrace Shakespeare's expansiveness. But the most radical change came with realism, the idea that plays should show life as it actually was, not heightened or poeticized, but mundane, contemporary, dealing with problems ordinary people faced. Henrik Ibsen in Norway pioneered this approach. His early work was poetic, historical, but then he turned to prose drama, to living rooms, and current social issues. A Doll's House shocked audiences across Europe, presented a wife and mother who walked out on her family, realizing her marriage was a lie, that she'd been treated as a doll, a plaything, not a full human being. The play ended with the door slamming, Nora leaving, and audiences didn't know what to make of it. Some theaters changed the ending, had Nora stay, couldn't accept that a woman would abandon her children. But Ibsen insisted on his vision. The play sparked debates about marriage, women's rights, individual freedom versus social duty. Ghosts went further, dealt with inherited disease, suggested that venereal illness could be passed to children, mentioned topics polite society refused to acknowledge. The play was banned, called obscene, disgusting, immoral. But Ibsen had opened a door that couldn't be closed, had shown that theater could confront contemporary problems directly, could make audiences uncomfortable, could challenge rather than simply entertain. Anton Chekhov in Russia took realism in a different direction, wrote plays where almost nothing happened. The Cherry Orchard presented a family losing their estate, knowing it would be sold, unable to do anything about it, talking endlessly, planning, dreaming, but never acting. The estate was sold, the cherry orchard cut down, and everyone scattered, disappointed but somehow accepting. Chekhov called it a comedy. Others saw it as tragedy. Perhaps it was both, or neither, simply life as it unfolded, without dramatic climaxes or clear resolutions. The Three Sisters, Uncle Vanya, plays where characters yearned for meaning, for Moscow, for work that mattered, for love that would transform their lives, but none of it came, or it came too late, or it came and turned out to be disappointing. Chekhov captured something essential about human experience, the way we live in hope, even when experience teaches us that hope is often disappointed, the way small moments of connection sustain us through long stretches of routine and frustration. His characters talked past each other, said one thing while meaning another, fell silent at crucial moments, behaved in ways that contradicted their stated intentions, and in doing so felt more real than the clearly motivated characters of traditional drama. Chekhov showed that theater didn't need grand gestures or momentous decisions. That ordinary life contained its own drama if you looked closely enough, if you could capture the rhythms of actual human interaction. George Bernard Shaw in England used the stage as a pulpit, wrote plays that were really arguments, essays disguised as drama, about economics, about war, about language and class and gender roles. Pygmalion presented a phonetics professor who taught a flower girl to speak like a duchess. Proving that class distinctions were artificial, matters of accent and manners rather than inherent worth, Shaw filled his plays with long speeches, debates where characters articulated opposing philosophies. He didn't trust audiences to extract the moral themselves, so he included lengthy prefaces explaining exactly what he meant, what conclusions they should draw. Major Barbara explored poverty and morality through the story of a Salvation Army officer whose father was an arms manufacturer. St. Joan presented the French heroine as a proto-Protestant, a rational thinker ahead of her time. Shaw admired her independence even as he showed why the church and state had to destroy her. His plays were intellectual, provocative, sometimes more interesting to read than to watch, but they expanded the territory drama could claim, proved that theater could engage with ideas as directly as essays or novels. August Strindberg in Sweden moved in another direction entirely, wrote plays that were intense, claustrophobic, focused on the war between men and women. Miss Julie presented A Midsummer Night when class barriers broke down, when an aristocratic woman seduced her father's valet, destroying both of them. Strindberg wrote in his preface about naturalism, about showing characters as products of their heredity and environment, but the play itself felt more primal, more mythic than any simple naturalistic description suggested. His later work became expressionistic, dreamlike. The Ghost Sonata moved through a house where nothing was as it seemed, where characters revealed themselves in fragments, where the boundary between living and dead grew uncertain. Strindberg showed that theater could externalize internal states, could make visible the psychological demons that haunted us, could abandon realism entirely in pursuit of deeper truths. The 20th century saw these various strands continue, diverge, combine in unexpected ways. Bertolt Brecht rejected the idea that audiences should identify with characters, should lose themselves in the story. He wanted alienation, wanted spectators to maintain critical distance, to think rather than feel. His plays included songs that commented on the action, direct addresses to the audience, placards announcing what would happen next, anything to prevent emotional absorption. Mother Courage and her children followed a woman through the 30 Years' War, showing how she profited from conflict while losing all 3 of her children to it. The play was set in the past, but commented on the present, on how capitalism and war fed each other, on how ordinary people collaborated in their own oppression. Brecht wanted audiences to leave the theater and change the world, to recognize that social conditions weren't natural or inevitable, but constructed, capable of being transformed. Samuel Beckett stripped theater down to its essentials, Waiting for Godot presented 2 men waiting for someone who never came. They talked, they argued, they considered leaving, but stayed. A boy arrived twice to say Godot wouldn't come today, but would come tomorrow. And that was essentially the entire play. No plot in any traditional sense, no character development, no resolution. Yet somehow it was funny, profound. It captured something about existence itself, about how we fill time, how we create meaning through repetition and routine, how we keep hoping despite all evidence that hope is futile. Endgame was even more minimal. 4 characters in a room, 2 in ashcans, unable to move, talking because silence was unbearable, because language was all they had left. Beckett's stage directions were precise, every pause marked, every gesture specified. He was writing a kind of music, using silence and sound, movement and stillness to create meaning beyond words. Harold Pinter brought what became known as the comedy of menace to English theater, wrote plays where ordinary rooms became threatening, where characters circled each other verbally, where what wasn't said mattered more than what was. The Birthday Party presented a man hiding in a seaside boarding house, visited by 2 strangers who might be representatives of some organization or might be figments of his paranoia. They interrogated him, broke him down, took him away, and we never learned what his crime was, or if there was a crime, or if the whole thing was ritual, performance, a power game played for its own sake. The Homecoming showed a family of men, a returning son bringing his wife to meet them, and over the course of an evening the family dynamic revealed itself as bizarre, threatening, the wife ultimately choosing to stay with this disturbing family, becoming their prostitute. The play never explained, never provided a psychological justification, simply presented behavior that was recognizably human, even as it was alien, unsettling. Eugene O'Neill in America wrote long plays, some lasting 4 or more hours, that drew on Greek tragedy and modern psychology simultaneously. Long Day's Journey into Night was autobiographical, presented his own family, his miserly father, his drug-addicted mother, his alcoholic brother, moving through a single day and night, revealing through repetition and accumulation how they'd wounded each other, how they were trapped in patterns none of them could break. The play ended with the mother lost in morphine dreams, the men watching helplessly, knowing the next day would be the same, and the next. Tennessee Williams wrote about desire and delusion, fragile people in a harsh world. The Glass Menagerie presented his own mother and sister barely disguised. A streetcar named Desire gave American theater one of its iconic characters, Blanche Dubois, a faded Southern belle clinging to gentility, arriving at her sister's apartment in New Orleans, unable to accept that her refined pretensions had no place there, broken finally by her sister's husband, a brute who saw through her immediately, who destroyed her illusions and sent her to an asylum. Arthur Miller wrote social dramas. Death of a Salesman presented Willy Loman, an aging salesman who'd believed in the American dream, worked hard, played by the rules, and ended up with nothing, his son's failures, his career over, his mind slipping between past and present. The play showed how capitalism chewed up workers, discarded them when they were no longer useful, but it was also a family tragedy, a story about fathers and sons, about delusion and reality, about the lies we tell ourselves to keep going. The Crucible used the Salem witch trials to comment on McCarthyism, on how communities tear themselves apart through accusations and suspicion, how good people get caught up in hysteria. Miller knew this firsthand, had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, had refused to name names. The play was historical but also immediate, a reminder that the past keeps recurring, that we're always capable of persecution if we're frightened enough. These playwrights, separated by centuries and continents, by language and culture and theatrical convention, nonetheless formed a kind of conversation, each one responding to predecessors, challenging assumptions, exploring new possibilities. They understood that theater was unique among art forms, that it required living bodies in shared space, that each performance was ephemeral, existing only in the moment of its occurrence, never quite the same twice. The great plays endured because they contained multitudes, could be interpreted differently by each generation, each production. Hamlet in the 19th century was a romantic hero. In the 20th, a modern neurotic. In the 21st, perhaps something else entirely. The text remained constant, but its meanings multiplied, shifted, evolved with changing contexts, and beneath all the differences of style and subject, all the movements and manifestos, the ancient Greeks and the moderns shared certain core insights. That drama was a way of examining what it means to be human, that putting actors on a stage and having them speak could reveal truths that other forms couldn't access, that an audience watching together created a kind of community, temporary but real, bound by shared attention, shared response to what unfolded before them. The theater in my imagination grows quiet now, the voices that filled it fading into memory, into history. Aeschylus and Sophocles, Shakespeare and Molière, Ibsen and Chekhov, Beckett and Pinter, each one adding to the great conversation, each one showing us ourselves reflected back, clarified, intensified, made visible in ways we couldn't quite see without the transformation that theater provides. I think about how plays are both fixed and fluid, words on a page that only come alive when spoken, when embodied, when witnessed. A script is a kind of score, a set of instructions, but the performance is always interpretation, always collaboration between playwright and actors and director and audience, all of them necessary, none sufficient alone. The empty stage can be anywhere, anytime, a castle in Denmark or a cherry orchard in Russia, a tenement in Brooklyn or a boarding house by the sea. The bare space transformed by agreement, by collective imagination, audiences suspending disbelief, accepting that these actors are those characters, that this platform is that place, entering into a contract that makes theater possible. And what we gain from this ancient art, this gathering in the dark to watch other humans pretend to be other humans, is hard to name, but unmistakable. A sense of connection, of shared experience, of recognition. We see characters facing dilemmas, making choices, suffering consequences, and we understand something about our own lives, our own possibilities, our own constraints. The great playwrights knew this, counted on it. They wrote for audiences they would never meet, in times they couldn't imagine, trusting that human nature remained constant enough, that the questions they explored would continue to resonate, that people centuries hence would still wonder about justice and love, about duty and desire, about what we owe to others and what we owe to ourselves. The plays themselves become like living things, passed down through generations, adapted, translated, reimagined, sometimes faithful to original intentions, sometimes wildly divergent, but always connecting past to present, showing that the distance between Sophocles and ourselves, between Shakespeare and now, is not as vast as chronology suggests, that the same passions, the same fears, the same hopes animate us still. I imagine actors throughout history speaking these lines, inhabiting these roles, making them new with each performance, and audiences throughout history, watching, listening, drawn into stories they knew or discovering stories for the first time. The transaction between stage and spectator unchanged despite all the changes in theater architecture, in lighting, in production values, the essential thing remaining constant, persons gathered, watching persons, seeking meaning through representation. The list of names could extend further. Luigi Pirandello exploring the boundary between reality and illusion, Garcia Lorca writing poetic tragedies about Spanish rural life, Carol Churchill experimenting with time and structure, August Wilson chronicling African-American experience across decades, Athol Fugard bearing witness to apartheid, the tradition continuing, evolving, responding to new circumstances while maintaining connection to ancient roots. But what matters most isn't the catalog of names, the chronology of movements, the history of theatrical innovation. What matters is the accumulated wisdom, the insights into human nature that these playwrights preserved, made available to anyone willing to sit in a darkened space and watch, to open themselves to the experience of seeing life distilled, concentrated, made into art that speaks across time. The candles in my imagined theater burn lower, the shadows deepen, but the stage remains, waiting for the next performance, the next interpretation, the next audience, because theater doesn't stop, doesn't conclude. It continues as long as people gather, as long as stories need telling, as long as we seek to understand ourselves through seeing ourselves reflected, transformed, made strange and familiar simultaneously. And perhaps that's the final gift of the great playwrights. They showed us that we're not alone in our struggles, our confusions, our joys, that others before us faced similar dilemmas, asked similar questions, and if they didn't always find answers, they at least found ways to articulate what it felt like to be alive, to be conscious, to be caught between desire and duty, hope and despair, self and society. The theater grows dark, the last light fading, but the words remain, waiting to be spoken again, waiting for new voices, new bodies, new audiences to discover them. And in that waiting, in that potential, the great playwrights live still. Their works not museum pieces, but living conversations, invitations to wonder, to question, to see ourselves and our world with fresh eyes, with the particular clarity that only theater, with its immediacy, its presence, its requirement of shared space and shared time, can provide. The light comes early in the North Woods, filtering through branches that have stood for longer than anyone can remember. And there is something about the way it falls, soft and golden, across the bark of white pine and hemlock, that makes time feel different, slower, as if the forest itself is breathing at a pace all its own. I find myself standing at the edge of something vast, not just in space, but in story, where the trees rise like cathedral columns, their trunks so wide that 3 men with arms outstretched could barely encircle them. And in the silence between birdsong, I can almost hear the echo of axes, the creak of leather harnesses, the low voices of men who made their living in these towering groves. This is the world of the lumberjack, though that word feels too small, too simple for what it really meant to work in the great timber stands of North America during those decades when the country was being built, board by board, from the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin, from the pine woods of Minnesota, from the Douglas fir stands of the Pacific Northwest, and the endless spruce forests that stretched across the northern reaches. The era I'm thinking of now, the one that unfolds in my mind like an old photograph slowly developing, spans roughly from the 1870s through the 1920s, though the exact boundaries are soft, like fog at the edge of a clearing, because industries don't begin and end with the turning of calendar pages. They rise like sap in springtime and fade like autumn color, gradually, inevitably. There's something almost mythic about this period, the peak years of the logging camps, when tens of thousands of men disappeared into the wilderness each autumn, when the fall colors began to turn and didn't emerge again until the spring thaw, when the rivers ran high and fast enough to carry their winter's work down to the mills. And it's easy to romanticize it, to picture rugged individuals conquering nature with nothing but muscle and steel. But the truth, as always, is more complex, more human, more worth understanding. The scale of it all is what strikes me first. The sheer magnitude of what was undertaken. Entire forests, some of which had been growing since before European contact, were surveyed, claimed, cut, and floated away, transformed from living ecosystems into the raw material of expansion, the lumber that built Chicago after the Great Fire, the timbers that shored up mine shafts in the Rockies, the boards that became farmhouses on the prairie, schoolhouses in young towns, boardwalks in boom cities. And yet, for all that scale, for all that industrial ambition, the work itself was done by hand, by men using tools that would have been recognizable to woodsmen centuries before, axes with carefully shaped handles, crosscut saws that sang their metallic song through the winter air, and later, as the industry grew, more specialized equipment, peavies and cant hooks for rolling logs, and eventually the first steam-powered machines that hissed and clanked at the landing sites. I think about the camps themselves, rough clusters of buildings set deep in the forest, far from any town, reachable only by logging road or frozen river, and in my mind's eye I can see the bunkhouses, long and low, with bunks stacked too high along the walls, a single wood stove in the center throwing off waves of heat, drying the wool socks and leather boots that hung on lines overhead, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat and damp wool, and men too tired to do much more than eat and collapse into their blankets. There's a rhythm to this world, a seasonal pulse that governed everything, and understanding that rhythm is like finding the key to a piece of music, because logging was never a year-round enterprise in these northern forests. It was a winter industry, when the ground froze hard enough to support the weight of loaded sleighs, when horses could haul massive logs across snow and ice, when men could work without the torment of black flies and mosquitoes, and when the cold itself became a tool, hardening the roads, preserving the food, keeping the rivers solid until the time came to break them open. So the story I'm following, the one that winds through these tall trees and across frozen lakes, begins in autumn, when the leaves turn and the air grows sharp, when the call goes out for men to fill the camps, and it stretches through the long darkness of winter, through the hard labor of felling and hauling, through the communal life of the bunkhouse and the cook shack, and culminates in spring, when the ice goes out and the river drives begin, and thousands upon thousands of logs go tumbling downstream, a wild and dangerous finale to months of careful work. The story doesn't begin with the great camps of the 1890s, or even with the first commercial sawmills that appeared along the eastern seaboard in colonial times. It begins much earlier, in the old growth forests themselves, in the centuries of undisturbed growth that created stands of timber unlike anything we can easily imagine today. When European settlers first arrived on the Atlantic coast, they encountered forests that seemed limitless, trees of such size and quality that a single white pine could yield masts tall enough and strong enough for the largest naval vessels, and the British Crown, recognizing the strategic value of this resource, began marking the finest specimens with the King's broad arrow, claiming them for the Royal Navy, reserving them against the needs of empire. This was logging's first incarnation in North America, selective, strategic, focused on the most valuable trees for shipbuilding, And the men who did this work were not yet called lumberjacks. They were simply woodsmen, working in small crews, often in summer when the rivers were navigable, felling giants with axes alone, since the cross-cut saw had not yet come into common use, and the work was slow, deliberate, almost intimate in its scale. The pine forests of New England were the first to feel the systematic bite of the axe, particularly in Maine, where rivers like the Penobscot and the Kennebec became highways for timber, their currents carrying logs to the coastal mills, and small logging operations began to establish patterns that would later be replicated across the continent. The use of river systems for transport, the seasonal nature of the work, the development of specialized tools and techniques. By the early 1800s, the industry was growing, driven by the needs of a young nation building itself up from raw materials, and the technology was evolving too. The crosscut saw, sometimes called a misery whip for the brutal nature of its use, began to replace the axe as the primary felling tool, allowing two men to bring down trees that would have taken a single axeman days to fell. And the lumber camp, as a distinct institution, began to take shape. These early camps were modest affairs, a few rough shelters thrown up near the cutting site, occupied by perhaps a dozen men. Local farmers, often, working the woods during the agricultural off-season to earn cash money, and there was still a connection to settled life, to towns and families that would fade as the industry pushed deeper into the wilderness, farther from the comforts of civilization. But it was the opening of the Great Lakes region, the vast forests of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, that transformed logging from a regional industry into something approaching a national obsession, something that would shape the very character of American expansion, because here were forests that dwarfed even the great pine stands of New England, white pines stretching as far as anyone could see, mixed with hardwoods, with hemlock and spruce, timber enough, it seemed to last forever. The timing was significant. This was the 1840s and 50s, a period of explosive growth, railroads pushing westward, cities rising seemingly overnight, the California gold rush creating boom towns that needed to be built from timber and boards, and the Great Lakes forests were perfectly positioned, accessible by water, by the natural highway of lakes and rivers that connected them to Chicago, to Buffalo, to all the growing markets of the interior. The men who recognized this opportunity, the lumber barons who had become wealthy beyond measure, began acquiring timber rights on an enormous scale, buying land from the federal government at $1.25 an acre, sometimes less. And what they were buying was not just land, but the trees themselves, white pine that had been growing for 200 years or more, resources that had accumulated over centuries, now to be liquidated in decades. And so the camps grew larger, more permanent, more organized. By the 1860s and 70s, a major logging camp might house 50 men, 100 men, eventually even more, and these were no longer farmers earning side money. These were professional woodsmen, men who followed the timber, moving from Michigan to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to Minnesota, living most of their lives in the deep woods, in a world governed by its own rules and rhythms. The work itself was being refined into something like a science, or perhaps an art, because there was a right way and a wrong way to do everything in the woods, and the difference could mean the difference between profit and loss, between safety and catastrophe. The sawyers learned to read a tree before they cut it, to understand the lean, the weight distribution, the internal tensions that could cause a trunk to split or kick back when the saw bit deep. They developed a vocabulary for their work, terms that sound almost like poetry when you hear them now. The undercut and the back cut, the holding wood that acted like a hinge, the widowmaker, that terrible phrase for a broken branch caught high in the canopy, waiting to fall on an unwary man below. And every term carried weight, carried the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned these lessons the hard way. The felling itself followed a pattern that became ritualized through repetition. The sawyers would approach a marked tree, one man on either end of the long cross-cut saw, and they would study it, walk around it, look up into its crown to see which way it wanted to fall, because a good sawyer worked with the tree, not against it, used its own weight and lean to guide it down into a clear space where it wouldn't shatter on impact, wouldn't hang up in the branches of its neighbors. Then came the undercut, a wedge chopped out of the side facing the intended direction of fall, and this had to be precise, the angle just right, the depth calculated to leave enough holding wood, and the two men would work in rhythm, their axe blows alternating, chips flying, the sharp crack of steel on wood echoing through the forest. After the undercut came the back cut, started on the opposite side, slightly higher than the deepest part of the undercut, and this was saw work, the long blades sliding back and forth, the men finding their rhythm, pushing and pulling, the teeth biting steadily deeper. And there was an art to it, keeping the saw level, maintaining the right amount of pressure, listening to the sound of the blade, which would change as it moved through the wood, through heartwood and sapwood, through the living core of a tree that might have germinated before Columbus sailed. And then, when the saw had bitten deep enough, there would come a moment of tension, a slight movement in the crown far above, a creaking sound like a door opening, and the sawyers would pull their blade free and step back, calling out timber, their voices ringing through the woods as warning, and the tree would begin its fall, slowly at first, then gathering speed, the crown sweeping down through the air, branches snapping until the moment of impact. A crash that shook the ground, that sent snow showering from nearby trees, that marked the end of 2 centuries of growth in a handful of seconds. But felling was only the beginning. The tree had to be limbed. The branches removed with swift axe work had to be bucked, cut into logs of manageable length, 16 feet, 20 feet, whatever the market demanded and the transportation could handle. And this, too, required skill, required understanding of where the log would be used, how it would be milled, what it was worth. And then came the question of moving it, of getting these massive logs, some weighing several tons, from where they fell to the landing site where they would wait for transport. And in the early days, this was done with horses or oxen, powerful draft animals that could drag a log chained behind them, but only if the ground was right, frozen hard, or smoothed by snow. And this is why winter became the season of logging in the northern forests. The development of the ice road was a turning point, an innovation that sounds simple but was actually quite sophisticated, because these weren't just paths through the snow. They were carefully engineered roadways, graded and cleared during the autumn, then iced throughout the winter by water tanks mounted on sleighs. Men would make runs at night when the temperature dropped lowest, spraying water that would freeze into a smooth, hard surface, a highway of ice that could support enormous loads. On these ice roads, the big sleighs would run, massive sleds piled high with logs, drawn by teams of horses, 2 horses, 4 horses, sometimes 6 or even 8 for the heaviest loads. And the sleighs themselves were marvels of practical engineering. The runners curved and shod with iron, the bunks where the logs rested carefully positioned to distribute the weight. Everything designed to make the best use of winter's temporary infrastructure. At the landing, the logs would be piled, stacked in enormous decks, marked with the company's stamp, a unique pattern of axe marks or paint that would identify ownership even after the logs were mixed with others in the river drive. And all winter long the piles would grow, the accumulated harvest of months of labor, waiting for the ice to break and the rivers to rise. The camps that supported this work were becoming small cities unto themselves, rough and temporary perhaps, but organized with surprising sophistication. There was a hierarchy, a structure, the camp boss who oversaw everything, the walking boss who supervised the cutting crews in the woods, the scaler who measured and tallied the harvest, the barn boss who cared for the horses, the cookie who assisted the all-important camp cook. And there were rules, unwritten but universally understood. No drinking in camp, no fighting, no stealing. Violations could mean immediate dismissal, a long walk back to civilization in the middle of winter. And there was a code, too, a sense of collective responsibility, because in the deep woods, far from doctors or law, men depended on each other absolutely. A broken leg could mean death if your bunkmates didn't care for you. A fire in the bunkhouse could kill everyone if someone didn't raise the alarm. The rhythm of the day was set by the cook's triangle, ringing out in the darkness of a winter morning, 4 o'clock, 4:30, calling men from their bunks to the cookhouse where breakfast waited. Enormous quantities of food, flapjacks and salt pork and beans, strong coffee and molasses, enough calories to fuel 12 or 14 hours of the hardest physical labor imaginable, and the men would eat in silence. That was the rule in many camps. No talking at meals, just the sound of forks on tin plates, of coffee being poured, of men fueling themselves for the day ahead. Then out into the cold, into darkness that was absolute, except for the lanterns carried by the walking boss, the men moving in a column along the tote road, their breath forming clouds in air so cold it burned the lungs, temperatures that could drop to 20 below, 30 below, even 40 below zero on the worst nights, and yet the work had to continue, because winter was short and the contract had to be filled. The forest in winter darkness has a quality unlike anything else, a silence so deep it seems to have weight, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow, the creak of leather, the occasional crack of a tree splitting in the cold. And as the men spread out to their assigned cutting areas, each team knowing their section, their trees, the forest would begin to wake with the sound of axes and saws, a rhythm that would continue until the light failed again in mid-afternoon. There was a mathematics to it all, a calculation that governed every decision. The cruisers had been through months before, walking the forest with their calipers and notebooks, measuring diameter at breast height, estimating board feet, marking trees with paint or axe blazes, and their surveys determined everything, where the camps would be placed, how many men would be needed, what the winter's cut should yield in lumber. A good white pine, straight and clear, might contain 1,000 board feet. enough lumber to frame a modest house, and a single cutting crew, 2 sawyers and their support team, might fell and process 8 to 10 such trees in a day, perhaps more if conditions were perfect, if the snow wasn't too deep, if the trees fell clean, if nothing went wrong, but something always went wrong. Saws would bind in the cut, trees would hang up in their neighbors' branches, equipment would break in the cold. The swampers followed behind the felling crews, clearing paths, building rough corduroy roads of small logs laid crosswise, creating the infrastructure that would allow the skidding teams to reach the felled timber. And this was hard work too. Unglamorous work, the kind that doesn't appear in the romantic tales of logging, but essential, because without clear paths the horses couldn't work, and without the horses the logs stayed where they fell. The teamsters were a breed apart, men who understood horses with an intimacy that went beyond simple animal handling. They could read a horse's mood by the set of its ears, could sense fatigue or strain before it became dangerous. And they had to, because a horse was valuable, worth $150 or more, far more than a man could earn in a month. And a good team could do the work of a dozen men if they were treated right, if they were fed well and not pushed beyond their limits. I think about those horses often, the Percherons and Belgians, the massive draft animals that were the engines of the logging industry, standing 16 hands high, weighing a ton or more, their breath steaming in the cold air, their hooves the size of dinner plates, shod with sharp caulks for gripping ice, and the care they received was extraordinary. Better housed than the men, their barn warm and weather-tight, their feed carefully measured, oats and hay brought in by the ton, because a horse that lost condition was a horse that couldn't work. The skidding itself was dangerous. Attaching chains to a log, making sure they were secure, then the teamster's call, the horses leaning into their collars, the chain going taut, and the log beginning to move, sliding across the snow, and if the chain broke under load, if it snapped like a rifle shot, the whipping metal could kill, or if a log shifted wrong, rolled unexpectedly, a man could be crushed before he could jump clear. At the landing, the loader crew took over, men with peavies and cant hooks, long-handled tools with a sharp point and a hinged hook, and they would roll the logs up skids onto the waiting sleigh, building the load with care, the largest logs on the bottom, the load carefully balanced, and when the sleigh was fully loaded, stacked higher than a man could reach, it might carry 20 tons, 30 tons, even more on a well-iced road with a strong team. The sleigh roads themselves were maintained constantly, a crew whose only job was keeping them smooth, keeping them iced, the water tank making its rounds at night, and there was an art to getting the ice just right, too thin, and it would crack under the weight, too thick, and the runners wouldn't slide properly, and the road crew became expert at reading conditions, at knowing when to add water, when to let it be, and then the great sleighs would begin their journeys, creaking and groaning under their loads, the horses straining, the teamster walking alongside, calling encouragement, watching for problems. And on downhill grades there was the hay, spread thick on the ice to slow the sleigh, because a runaway load was a catastrophe, tons of logs sliding faster and faster, the team unable to hold it back, and men had died that way, crushed when a load got away from them. The evenings in camp were brief, the men too tired for much beyond eating and collapse. But there were moments, Sunday afternoons sometimes, when no work was done, when someone might bring out a fiddle, or a man with a good voice might sing the old songs, the lumber camp ballads that told stories of the work, of disasters and triumphs, of men who died in the woods, of legendary loaders and sawyers, songs that served as the oral history of an industry, passed from camp to camp, from season to season. There was The Jam on Jerry's Rock, about a river driver killed when a log jam broke, and the logger's boast, full of braggadocio and humor, and dozens of others, some with melodies borrowed from Irish or Scottish traditions, the lyrics adapted to fit the North American experience. And these songs did something important. They made sense of the work. They turned hardship into narrative. They gave men a way to understand their place in something larger than themselves. The food in the camps was legendary, not for quality perhaps, but for quantity. A camp cook feeding 50 men through a winter needed to be part quartermaster, part magician, working with supplies that had been hauled in during the fall, barrels of salt pork and flour, sacks of beans and dried peas, molasses by the gallon, dried fruit, canned milk, potatoes stored in root cellars dug into the frozen ground. And from these basic ingredients, the cook would produce meals that workers remembered decades later. Enormous pots of beans baked with molasses and salt pork, stews thick enough to stand a spoon in, bread baked daily in quantities that seem impossible, flapjacks by the hundreds, pies made from dried apples, and always the coffee, strong enough to strip paint, kept hot on the stove all day because men coming in from the cold needed it, depended on it. The cookhouse was sacred space, the one warm, well-lit building in camp, and the cook's authority was absolute. Even the camp boss deferred to the cook in his own domain, because a good cook kept men fed and content, kept them working, while a bad cook could empty a camp in a week. Men voting with their feet, walking out to find another operation with better food. But beyond the daily rhythm of work and meals, there was the larger pattern of the season to consider, the way autumn turned to deep winter, and deep winter began, imperceptibly at first, to soften toward spring, and this transition was watched anxiously because the entire enterprise was a race against the thaw. All those thousands of logs piled at the landing had to reach the river before the ice roads melted, had to be rolled onto the ice of the river or lake before the breakup came. The spring breakup was an event, a transformation. Ice that had been solid enough to support buildings would suddenly turn rotten, honeycomb with meltwater, and then one day, often with startling suddenness, it would go out, the river breaking free of winter's grip. And this was the signal, the moment when logging transformed into river driving, when a different set of skills became paramount. The river drivers were specialists, men who could walk on floating logs as casually as others walked on solid ground, who could read water, understand currents, predict where a jam might form, and they would follow the logs downstream, riding them, guiding them, breaking up jams with peavies and dynamite, sleeping rough on the banks, eating cold food, working in water so cold it could kill in minutes. And this was considered the most dangerous work in an already dangerous industry. But I'm moving ahead, jumping past the deep winter, past the long months of cutting and skidding, and there's more to understand about that time, about the middle period of the season, January into February, when the work had found its rhythm, when the camp had settled into itself, when the initial excitement of the season had worn off, and what remained was simply the daily grind of labor. This was when injuries happened most often, when familiarity bred carelessness, when the cold was deepest and most unrelenting, when men's attention might wander, and a wandering attention in the woods could mean a saw bite, an axe glancing off and cutting a leg, a log rolling onto a foot, and the camp's medical care was rudimentary at best. Perhaps a foreman who had learned some basic first aid, a medicine chest with iodine and bandages, and the nearest doctor might be a 2-day journey away. The isolation was profound in some camps, particularly those in the more remote areas. There might be no contact with the outside world from November until April. No mail, no news, no visitors, just the closed circle of the camp, the same faces day after day, and this took a psychological toll, led to tensions, to feuds over trivial matters, to the occasional fight despite the rules against it. And yet there was also a camaraderie, a bond formed by shared hardship, by depending on each other in ways that town life never required. Men would speak of their bunkmates, their crew, with a loyalty that lasted lifetimes, would return year after year to the same camp, to work with the same men, because they had learned to trust each other, had survived together, and that meant something. The lumber barons themselves were mostly absent from this world. They stayed in offices in Saginaw or Minneapolis or Seattle. They made the deals, secured the financing, bought the timber rights, but they rarely visited the camps, rarely saw the actual work being done. And this distance, this separation between ownership and labor, was part of what would eventually lead to conflict, to the labor movements that would rise in the early 20th century. But that, too, is getting ahead of the story. For now, in this middle period, we're dwelling in the late 1880s into the 1890s. The industry was at something like its peak, at least in terms of the old methods, the hand labor and horsepower that had brought it to this point. The camps were larger than ever, more efficient, more productive, and the cut was staggering. Michigan alone was producing billions of board feet annually, entire forests disappearing in a generation. The technology was evolving too, though slowly, incrementally. The cross-cut saws were being refined, new tooth patterns that cut faster, handles designed for better grip, and the axes were works of art in their own way. Hand-forged heads of specific weights and profiles, handles of second-growth hickory, shaped to fit the individual user's hand and swing, and a good axeman could maintain his tools with remarkable precision, sharpening on a whetstone with patient strokes until the edge would shave hair from his arm. But the real changes, the ones that would transform everything but key, were beginning to appear at the margins. Steam power was coming to the woods, first in the form of steam donkeys, stationary engines that could pull logs with steel cables, doing the work of a dozen horse teams, and these machines were cumbersome, required enormous amounts of fuel, needed skilled engineers to operate them, but they hinted at what was coming, at the mechanization that would eventually make the traditional lumber camp obsolete. The railroads were pushing deeper into timber country too, logging railroads, narrow gauge lines built specifically to haul logs, and these opened up regions that had been inaccessible before, areas too far from rivers for water transport, too remote for ice roads, and the railroad changed the economics entirely, made year-round logging possible, eliminated the need for the Spring River Drive, and slowly The center of the industry began to shift from the Great Lakes states toward the Pacific Northwest, toward the vast stands of Douglas fir and redwood. In the Northwest, the trees were different, bigger in a way that defied belief. Douglas firs that could be 10 feet across, 15 feet, redwoods that dwarfed even those. And the logging techniques that had worked in Michigan and Wisconsin had to be adapted, expanded, because you couldn't fall a redwood with a simple cross-cut saw. You needed springboards, platforms inserted into notches, cut high in the trunk, above the swollen base, and the sawyers would stand on these narrow boards, 20 feet above the ground, and work from there, the saw singing through wood that might be 1,000 years old. The scale of logging in the Northwest was industrial from the beginning, less about individual skill and more about machinery, about steam donkeys and high-lead systems, cables strung through the forest like enormous spider webs. And the camps there were different too, less isolated, closer to towns, because the railroads made that possible, and the work was, if anything, more dangerous. The trees so large that when they fell, they could shatter like bombs, sending shrapnel of wood flying in every direction, killing men hundreds of feet away. But back in the Great Lakes region, in the early years of the 20th century, change was coming in a different form. The timber was running out. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in region after region, the great pine forests that had seemed inexhaustible were being cut over. The land left in a devastation of stumps and slash, and the companies were moving on, following the timber, leaving behind communities that had grown up around the mills, towns that suddenly had no reason to exist. There were attempts at conservation, voices raised in concern. Gifford Pinchot and others arguing for sustainable forestry, for rust replanting, for leaving seed trees. But the industry was not structured to think in those terms. The lumber barons had paid for the trees. They owned them. And the prevailing attitude was to extract maximum value as quickly as possible, and then move on to the next stand, the next state, the next forest. The men who did the work, the actual lumberjacks, were changing too, or rather the workforce was diversifying. Where once it had been primarily men of Yankee stock, New Englanders who had followed the timber west. Now there were Scandinavians, Finns and Swedes and Norwegians who brought their own traditions, their own songs, their own ways of working, and French Canadians coming down from Quebec, and later, in the Northwest, Asian immigrants, Japanese and Chinese workers, each group adding to the mix, creating a culture that was uniquely North American, forged from many traditions. The Finns, in particular, left their mark. They brought the sauna to the logging camps, a luxury that might seem absurd in such rough conditions, but which was valued beyond measure, a chance to truly get clean, to sweat out the aches and cold. And they brought their radical politics too, their ideas about workers' rights and collective action, and the industrial workers of the world found fertile ground in the logging camps, where conditions were hard and profits flowed primarily to distant owners. The strikes began in the early 1900s, work stoppages, demands for better food, for safer conditions, for an 8-hour day instead of the dawn to dark schedule that had always prevailed. And some of these strikes succeeded, forcing improvements, while others were broken, sometimes violently. But the very fact of them showed that something was shifting, that the old paternalistic model of the lumber camp was no longer sustainable. World War I brought its own changes, a massive demand for lumber, for spruce especially, which was needed for aircraft construction, and the government took an active role, setting up the spruce production division, essentially militarizing logging in the Northwest. And this brought standardization, safety regulations, improvements in camp conditions, because the government needed production but also needed to maintain morale, needed to keep workers from fleeing to better conditions elsewhere. And then the war ended, and there was a brief boom, and then the economy contracted. And the 1920s brought a different kind of pressure, competition from the South, from the pine forests of Georgia and the Carolinas, where labor was cheaper and the trees grew faster, and from new materials too, concrete and steel beginning to replace wood in many applications, and the market for lumber became less certain, less reliable. The technology continued to advance. The chainsaw was being developed, crude and heavy at first, a two-man saw powered by a gasoline engine, but revolutionary nonetheless, because it could do in minutes what took hours with a crosscut. And the men who used these early chainsaws were pioneers of a sort, learning to handle tools that were dangerous, that could kick back, that required constant maintenance, but that increased productivity enormously. And with each technological advance, fewer men were needed. A crew with a chainsaw and a bulldozer could do the work of 50 men with hand tools and horses. And so the great camps began to shrink, to modernize, men going home at night instead of staying in bunkhouses, commuting to the woods in trucks instead of walking in for the season. And something was being lost, even as efficiency was being gained. The old-timers, the men who had worked in the camps in the 1890s, would shake their heads at the changes, would talk about how soft the modern loggers had it with their power tools and their shorter hours. And there was some truth in that, but there was nostalgia too, a selective memory that forgot the hardship, the cold, the injuries, the men who died young from the work, and remembered only the camaraderie, the sense of being part of something grand. By the 1930s, the Great Depression slowed everything. Mills closed, camps shut down. Men who had spent their lives in the woods found themselves unemployed, and some of them went into the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC camps that were in some ways the descendants of the logging camps, young men living in the forest, doing conservation work instead of cutting, planting trees instead of felling them. And there was an irony in that the skills developed to harvest the forest were now being used to restore it. The Second World War brought another surge, another desperate need for lumber, for the construction of military bases, of ships, of 1,000 wartime applications, and the industry ramped up again. But this time with even more mechanization, with trucks replacing horses entirely, with tractors and loaders, and the number of men needed continued to decline even as production increased. And in the years after the war, in the late 1940s and into the 50s, the last of the old-style lumber camps closed. The bunkhouses were abandoned. The cook shacks fell into ruin, and logging became just another job, still dangerous, still hard, but no longer the all-consuming seasonal odyssey it had once been, no longer a world unto itself. The peak era, the time we've been moving through, was roughly from 1870 to 1920, 50 years when the great northern forests were systematically harvested, when tens of thousands of men spent their winters in the deep woods, when the lumber camp was a distinct and vital American institution, and by the middle of the 20th century it was essentially over, transformed beyond recognition, or simply gone. What remains now are traces, old photographs showing men standing beside enormous stumps, their axes resting on their shoulders, museums, displays of cant hooks and peaveys, a few preserved camp buildings, and the stories passed down through families of grandfathers and great-grandfathers who worked in the woods, who were part of that great extraction, that transformation of forest into the built environment we inhabit today. And there's the land itself, the cut-over regions of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, where second growth and third growth forests now stand, smaller trees, younger trees, but forests nonetheless, recovering in their own time, their own way, and the clear cuts of the Pacific Northwest, some replanted, some naturally regenerating, the forest slowly reclaiming what was taken. The story has a weight to it, a complexity that resists simple judgments, because it was both an ecological catastrophe and an essential industry, both an exploitation and a livelihood, both a destruction of ancient ecosystems and the creation of the material basis for modern society. And the men who did the work were neither villains nor heroes. They were simply workers, doing what needed to be done, or what they were told needed to be done in the economic and social context of their time. And yet, if we step back from the timeline, from the march of decades and technological changes, and think instead about what it meant, what it really meant, to spend a winter in the deep woods, we might begin to understand something about the human side of all this, about the interior experience of men who lived for months in a world reduced to essential elements, work and weather, food and exhaustion, the company of other men, and the vast silence of the forest. There was a stripping away that happened in the camps of pretense, of social niceties, of everything that wasn't necessary, because when you're working 14 hours in temperatures that can kill you, when you're sharing a bunkhouse with 50 other men, when your survival depends on your strength and your attention and the reliability of your crew, the superficial falls away, and what remains is something more fundamental, more honest, perhaps, than what exists in the comfort of towns and cities. The men themselves were aware of this. You can see it in the letters some of them wrote, in the diaries a few kept, this sense that the woods changed them, made them different from the men they had been, or the men they became when they returned to civilization each spring. And there was often a pull, a drawback to the camps, despite the hardship, because something about that life spoke to them, answered some need that ordinary society couldn't meet. Perhaps it was the clarity of it, the way the work was tangible, immediate. You could see what you accomplished each day. The trees you felled, the logs you skidded, the deck growing at the landing, and there was satisfaction in that, in physical labor that produced visible results, in being part of a crew where everyone's contribution mattered, where competence was respected and incompetence couldn't hide. Or perhaps it was the rhythm, the way the days followed a pattern set by nature rather than by clock time. Up before dawn, because that's when winter dawn comes. Working until the light fails because winter light is precious. Eating when the cook rang the triangle. Sleeping when exhaustion demanded it. And there's something deeply human about living according to natural cycles, something we lose when we're governed entirely by artificial schedules and electric light. The relationship with the forest itself was complex, contradictory even, because these were men whose livelihood depended on destroying what they also, in some way, revered. They knew the woods intimately, could read sign like a language, could identify trees by their bark in darkness, could navigate by subtle landmarks, the shape of a ridge, the sound of a particular creek, and they took a kind of pride in their knowledge, in their ability to survive and work in conditions that would break city men, and yet they were also agents of the forest's destruction. And some of them felt the weight of cutting trees that had been alive since before their grandfathers were born, felt something like guilt, or at least ambivalence, though they rarely spoke of it directly, because what good would it do? The work had to be done, the contract had to be filled, and individual feelings didn't change the larger economic forces that drove the industry, the accidents, the injuries and deaths that were a constant presence, created their own kind of knowledge, awareness of mortality that was immediate and physical. Men saw their bunkmates crushed by falling trees, saw hands mangled by equipment, saw the quick death that could come from a moment's inattention. And this created a particular kind of fatalism, an acceptance that the work was dangerous and you might not survive it, but also a determination to do it well, to not let fear paralyze you, to maintain your skill and attention because that was your only real protection. There were rituals around death in the camps, informal ones, not written down anywhere, but understood. When a man died, his belongings would be gathered, his wages calculated, and someone, usually the walking boss or the camp clerk, would write a letter to his family if he had one, and the letter would be factual, brief, not dwelling on the circumstances, just stating what happened and when. And there would be a collection, usually, men contributing what they could to help with the funeral expenses or to support a widow. And then the work would continue, because it had to, because stopping wouldn't bring the dead man back, and his bunk would be filled by someone new, and within days it would be as if he'd never been there, except in the memories of the men who knew him, who might tell stories about him on Sunday afternoons, who might sing a verse about him if someone made up a ballad. And that was the memorial he got, brief and informal but genuine. The seasons marked time in a way that's hard to understand now, when we can have strawberries in January and heating in August, when climate control insulates us from weather. But in the camps, winter was absolutely dominant, inescapable. It dictated everything: the work, the clothing, the food, the very structure of daily life, and the progression from early winter to deep winter to late winter was something everyone was acutely aware of, because each phase had its own character, its own challenges. Early winter, November into December, was almost optimistic. The cold was bracing but not yet brutal. The days were shortening, but there was still decent light. The men were fresh, eager to prove themselves, and the work went quickly. But then came January, February, when the cold settled in like a permanent condition, when the sun barely cleared the horizon, when every day was a test of endurance. And this was when the camp either came together or fell apart, when leadership mattered, when the cook's skill could make the difference between a content crew and a rebellious one. And then March, when the light began to return, when temperatures moderated, when you could feel spring coming even though snow still lay deep, and there was a quickening, a sense of urgency, because the time for cutting was drawing to a close. The ice roads would soon be unusable, and everything had to be positioned for the river drive. All the winter's work had to be ready, and the pace increased, the hours lengthened. One final push before the transformation from logging to driving. The river drives themselves were a whole other world, a whole other story, and the men who specialized in that work were different from the sawyers and teamsters. They needed different skills, balance and agility, the ability to read water, a kind of fearlessness that bordered on recklessness, because walking on floating logs, jumping from one to another, riding them through rapids, this required a commitment to the moment, a complete presence that not everyone could manage, but even the drives were changing, becoming less necessary as railroads penetrated deeper into timber country. And by the 1920s, the great spring drives were mostly memory. Logs were being trucked or hauled by rail directly to the mills, and something wild was being tamed. Something dangerous and spectacular was being replaced by something safer and more efficient, but also less alive somehow, less vital. And so we come to the end of it, to the fading of the lumber camp era, to the closing of a chapter in North American history. And what lingers is not just the facts, the dates and production figures, the technological changes, but the human experience of it, the texture of that life, the particular quality of existence in those remote camps in the deep woods, the last men who worked in the old-style camps, who lived through entire winters in bunkhouses, who cut trees with crosscut saws and moved them with horse teams. Those men are gone now. The last of them died decades ago. And with them went a certain kind of knowledge, a bodily understanding of work and weather and wood that can't really be reconstructed from books or photographs, though we try, though we preserve what we can in museums and historical societies. What remains in the landscape are the traces, the old railroad grades grown over with brush, the collapsed remains of camp buildings, the enormous stumps, rotting slowly, that mark where the great trees stood. And if you know where to look, if you walk the back country of Michigan or Wisconsin or the Pacific Northwest, you can find these remnants, these ghosts of an industry, and they speak quietly of what happened here. The forests have returned in their way, second growth and third growth, and in another century or two, maybe longer, they'll approach again the grandeur of what was lost. The trees won't be as large, perhaps. The ecosystems won't be quite the same, but there will be forests, life reasserting itself, the patient work of regeneration that proceeds whether we notice it or not. And in the small towns that were once mill towns, logging towns, there are still families who remember, grandchildren of lumberjacks who heard the stories, who preserve photographs, who feel a connection to that history, to the men who came before. And this, too, is a kind of continuation, a remembering that keeps something alive even as the physical reality recedes further into the past. The lumber that was cut during those peak decades, some of it is still in use. Old growth boards in the frames of houses, timbers in the basements of century-old buildings. And this wood has qualities that modern lumber doesn't. The grain is tighter, the wood harder, because it grew slowly in the cold northern climate, and it will likely outlast the buildings it supports, will persist as a material remnant of forests that no longer exist. There's a certain poetry in that, in the way the forest was transformed but not destroyed, changed from living trees into the framework of human habitation. And the men who did that work, who spent their winters in the cold and their springs on the rivers, they were part of a transformation, witnesses to and agents of a change that shaped the continent. And now, as the story winds down, as we reach the natural end of this remembering, what I'm left with is images, fragments, the sound of a crosscut saw echoing through winter trees, the smell of a bunkhouse, smoke and wool and coffee, the sight of a great pine beginning its fall, the crown sweeping down through its own branches, the impact that shakes the ground, and the men themselves lean and hard from the work, their hands scarred and calloused, their faces weathered, standing in old photographs with a kind of dignity, a seriousness, as if they understood they were part of something significant, something that would be remembered, even if they couldn't quite articulate what or why. The peak lumberjack era. Those decades from the 1870s to the 1920s, when the northern forests fell and an industry reached its apex before beginning its long decline, it's a story of transformation, of labor and landscape, of men and trees and the intersection between human need and natural abundance. And it fades now into history, into memory, into the quiet of a winter forest where the wind moves through branches, where snow falls softly on ground that was once camp, where time moves forward, but the past remains, layered beneath, waiting for anyone who cares to listen, to look, to remember. The story ends, as all stories must, but the forest continues, growing, changing, persisting, and somewhere in the space between what was and what is, the echo of axes, the song of saws, the voices of men long gone still resonate faintly like a dream half remembered, fading into silence.